In this podcast, I'm going to cover all the evidence of Danny Casolaro's research, his interviews with appropriate witnesses, the testimonies that I've had in interviewing Michael Riconosciuto, also the interviews with Daniel Sheehan with his independent evidence on certain matters that overlap with the secret team being involved with the bombing of Pan Am 103 in December 1988. It will also bring together evidence. I've interviewed Margie Sloan, who did a full investigation uncovering the links of Wackenhut with Ishwan Barbuti and Richard Secord, and their involvement in links with the bombing of Pan Am 103 and also the sales of chemical weapons and to Iraq and to Libya involving the secret team. So this is an overview of historical collection of evidence that independently will endeavour to show you the overwhelming evidence that the secret team was behind the bombing of Pan Am 103, given that the McKee team were returning to the USA with overwhelming evidence that Ted Shackley's secret team were involved in illegal drugs and arms trafficking that was jeopardising their efforts to rescue hostages in Lebanon and Iran. So let's go through the evidence and the history and chronology as we look at this. And it's only when you look at historical documents over investigating this for 21 years that you can see a pattern of behaviour that will be revealed that's very complex, extremely complex, but the laws of probability, when you put all of the evidence in chronological order, it's conclusive evidence that Danny Casolaro was actually on the tail of the secret team, given his discussions and interviews with Danny Sheehan, and also his interviews with Lester Coleman and Michael Riconosciuto and William Hamilton, when he was investigating evidence that the secret team was involved in money laundering of drugs and arms through BCCI, had stolen Inslaw's PROMIS software that was integrated into the banking system to allow them to covertly money launder their illegal funds internationally. And also he was investigating the evidence of the secret team and its original involvement way back to the dismissal of Gough Whitlam in Australia, the involvement of selling drugs and arms linked to the Wackenhut, Cabazon Indian Casino and Cabazon Arms with the Gambino Mafia and the Nugan Bank, and of course October Surprise, the scandal behind that, and also the evidence leading to the cover-up of their direct involvement in Iran-Contra, and also, more importantly, which is linking to this particular evidence relating to the bombing and their motive for bringing down Pan Am 103, is also linked to the Iraqgate scandal involving their sales of chemical weapons, weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons, nerve gases to Iraq and to Libya. So let's commence the journey looking at it from the eyes of Danny Casolaro, and what did he uncover and how can we put this together? After reviewing all of his evidence, I've summarised the key components of what I believe his evidence was pointing to with Daniel Sheehan's to identify the head of the octopus. And the key people that I believe are the brains from the evidence that's been collapsed down was George Pender, who was personally appointed by Howard Hughes, Vice President George Bush at the time, after being the director of CIA and then becoming President of the United States, Ted Shackley, William Casey, Robert Gray, and Frank Colucci. They're the people that I believe the evidence points to as being the brains. I would add Kissinger, Henry Kissinger, to it as well, and I will do that in a future podcast to show you the chronology of evidence, and I'll touch on it today to demonstrate the evidence that he will be there as well with them. So the entities are that they, in my previous podcast, I had shown you that they had infiltrated all the intelligence databases, the designs, the software development, the configurations of them to fuse, for the fusion of all intelligent databases of CIA, DIA, NSA, DEA, Department of Defense, and also into Justice, Customs, where they were controlling what the eyes could see. That's why I've called this the sixth eye. It's under the name of national security for echelon for the five eyes, but I believe their private corrupt organisation was a higher level of six eye, and it knew no boundaries. It wasn't restrained to United States. It was global. But this is the genesis of it. And so they controlled the formation of the CIA Counterterrorism Centre with Claridge and Canestraro. FIDCO, they owned with George Pender, Robert Mayhew and Clint Murchison Jr. And yes, Robert Booth Nichols is in there, but I don't believe he's the brains. I think he's just the money launderer for all the drugs with the Gambino and the Cali cartels. I'm also going to mention to you that Daniel Sheehan, in his investigations with the Christic Institute, identified Overseas Press Services Inc., which involves John Singlaub and Richard Secord and Oliver North, with a warehouse of over a ton of C4 explosives. Putting together the front, the Dirty Tricks program, and the way that they influence the policies of governments in the United States and worldwide to adopt their fascist far-right policies to keep them in power, was WACL, USCWF, and I'll describe those in detail later for you, Council for World Freedom, CNP, and AmeriCare, which involved Singlaub as one of the founders across it, Viguri, the Hunts, Peter Grace, head of the Knights of Malta, and the surprise for everyone will be Pat Robertson. Now, as we're moving into the 80s, Ted Shackley has distanced himself from Eastco and has formed two companies, one called TGS International, which is set up for all his business in Kuwait. And it involves Shackley and a gentleman by the name of Razmara, who's linked to Iranian intelligence during the fall of the Shah of Iran. And I'll have a second part of this podcast. This will be podcast 27A, and 27B will reveal what TGS International with Shackley and Razmara were really doing worldwide. Of course, Stanford Technology, the enterprise set up with Secord and Hakim. IBI International, run by Ishram Barbuti. Cardone Industries by Carlos Cardone, and Wackenhut, where they had Frank Colucci eventually on the board during a critical time. And then I'll show you the link of the evidence that Wackenhut was responsible for all security, airport security for passengers and planes and luggage and scanning with x-rays for Pan Am internationally and Heathrow Airport. And it had relationships with Ishram Barbuti and Secord and the secret team. which Danny Casolaro had uncovered, which I'll touch on again, in counter-terrorism, a secret counter-terrorism and assassination team being set up by Dwayne Claridge, Ted Shackley, Richard Secord, John Singlaub. So, overarching, during the 80s through to the 90s, Gray & Co. evolved into Hill and Knowlton, and you had on the board Gray, Rogers, Livingston, and Admiral Murphy from President Bush's office. And they had control over the dirty tricks and the smearing of anyone that would uncover their illegal activities. They could destroy any politician, any business leader, any government official who would be exposing what their corrupt activities were doing worldwide. And, of course, they're in control of representing Nuganhan Bank, Banco Ambrosiana, BCCI, and, of course, Citibank for the laundering of all their illegal drugs and arms. So let's now go forward and have a look, a recap of podcast 26. I revealed the chronology and evidence of Ed Wilson financing the companies right through to Hadron Inc., Simcon Inc., for the development of the fusion of all intelligence databases for William Casey called the SAFE software. And then it was commercialized as Swift Banking Intelligence Software, which was then put into all the banks by Robert Gray and Henry Kissinger and Associates to the Club of Rome banks worldwide. They controlled all the intelligent databases under Lucien Conin for anything to do with narcotics, suppliers, users, money launderers, distributors, convictions, undercover agents, undercover informers, so that they could control all investigations and tip off the cartels and prevent them from being detected. I'll show you the evidence also that Ted Shackley and his secret team were selling all the radar systems for the drug interdiction program and with Wackenhut. And more importantly, they were also selling all the radar detection technology to allow the cartels to fly their drugs in by planes, ships, and through roads, by trucks, transport, to avoid being detected by the drug interdiction program. So, Lockerbie plane bombing, flight from truth. This is a summary of Charlie McKee's team flying back with the evidence that Ted Shackley's secret team are involved in illegal drugs and arms operations internationally that was jeopardizing his efforts and team's effort to rescue the hostages in Lebanon and Iran, and was going to blow the whistle. The investigation of the Pan Am Flight 103 didn't take into account the wads of US dollars or the heroin or the Hezbollah t-shirt found in the wreckage. As the man convicted of the bombing prepares to appeal, John Ashton and Ian Ferguson argue that there has been a top-level cover-up. He was returning with a suitcase belonging to Major Charles McKee, a senior CIA agent who was the deputy chief in Lebanon, was flying back on the same plane with him, and they were both involved with the negotiations of the release of hostages in Beirut, and had been mysteriously carried away from the piles of wreckage left by the crash, and even had a large hole cut out into it before it was returned to the investigators. His real assignment reportedly was to work with the CIA in negotiating the American hostages in Lebanon, and then, if feasible, lead a daring raid that would rescue them. So, we have allegations that were raised at the time. In the newspapers, congressmen claimed CIA was tipped off about the blast. CIA had been tipped in advance that terrorists might attempt to blow up Pan Am's Flight 103, but remained silent. Rep. James Trifficant said the report concluded the CIA was covering up a drug run, protecting the terrorists' Frankfurt to New York heroin route in exchange for contacts that might lead to the release of American hostages. That may be true. He also said the McKee was stationed in Beirut working to free the hostages. At the same time, CIA allegedly was covering up the drug ring. McKee, 40, was among those killed on Flight 103 bombing. If he discovered a faction of the CIA working separately, he would have been resentful and demanded answers. Quoted from his mother. He said the report detailed a web of plots and connections involving hostages, spies, bombers, and drug runners. Among the claims in the report is that the West German intelligence agents told CIA agents in Frankfurt about an hour before Flight 103 departed that they suspected a bomb may be enclosed in a specific suitcase. Trifficant said the mother of Army Major Charles McKee of Trafford, Westmoreland County, said she hoped a further report expected to be issued today would determine her son was unwillingly caught up in the alleged drug-running ring. And so if he discovered a faction of CIA working separately, he was going to blow the whistle. He was returning to the United States with film detailing the location of the American hostages. The mother said her son was a photographer and that Scotland investigators confiscated film from her son's body after the crash. She said the film had been in a secure box and was developed and turned over to American investigators. Trifficant said McKee and Matthew Gannon, the CIA deputy station chief in Beirut, knew the CIA was protecting the heroin ring and planned to tell US officials this was hindering efforts to win the hostages' release. So that summarises a motive for allowing for a bomb to be put onto the plane to kill the McKee team and also the deputy chief of CIA in Lebanon. So now I'll declare to you my recorded interviews over 21 years with Michael Riconosciuto's wife and Michael Riconosciuto himself. Just to put on the record for you, in a recorded interview with Michael Riconosciuto's wife, while Michael was in prison, she confirmed that Michael had just returned from overseas, was so tired he'd fallen asleep in the next room. She was watching TV with her children when all of a sudden the news broke about the bombing of Pan Am 103 on TV. She was in shock. She ran immediately and woke up Michael. Michael came back, saw it on the TV, and immediately said to her, "Robert Booth Nichols is the leak." Robert Booth Nichols is the leak. And she said that he immediately made telephone calls, couldn't get through to somebody, so he immediately flew to another location to get to this person, and when he arrived he found that they were also dead. Michael has confirmed that that was a remaining member of the McKee team that flew home earlier and had been murdered. So let's have a look at my interview. This is what Michael states on the record. I was monitoring the hostage situation in Iran and Lebanon, staying at the apartment of Robert Booth Nichols and his wife Alan Hopko Nichols were located near Nicosia Cyprus Airport. Robert Booth Nichols and Alan Nichols were running Eurorame Trading Corporation set up as a listening post. Robert Nichols and myself were both working for George Pender. The secret team were also involved in controlled drug operations run by the CIA. I returned to my home in Oregon. I knew the McKee team would be returning to the United States to blow the whistle on the drug operations being run by the secret team. When the warning came to the unit in Nicosia that there might be a bombing of Pan Am 103, Michael states that Robert Booth Nichols assured him that he would immediately change the flight reservations for the McKee team to another flight, just as FBI agent Oliver Buck Revell had done for his son. Now, over 21 years, I've been communicating directly with Michael Riconosciuto by letter in prison. And after many years, a few years ago, when he was released, I can speak to him almost every day via telephone. But for 21 years, everyone questions his credibility. But when I check out his evidence that he gives me relating to Australia that no one else could ever know, I can verify even more confidential government reports, top secret reports on projects that Michael had been working on in Australia, and also, as you can see from the evidence of my previous podcasts relating to Nugan Bank, and also the secret team involved in destroying Gough Whitlam in the $4 billion loans affair, and plus uncovering the history of PROMIS and its application for Echelon. There are things that you cannot make up. So when you try to recover under access to freedom of information the records of Michael, this is what you can get. And this was done by another attorney previously, which he provided to me when he tried to get full access to 599 pages of records that are on Michael Riconosciuto. So think about that. 599 pages of records exist on him, and you can only get 2. Now, classifications that come with their release are B1. B1 means that it's been sealed by executive level of the President of the United States. B2 relates to top national security of NSA. And B3 is national security relevant to CIA. And then you've got various other levels where they're trying to protect informants and confidential processes of collecting information, but B1, B2 and B3 are of the highest levels. So first of all, many people in the media like to say, oh, he's just a drug dealer. Well, if he's a drug dealer, how many drug dealers do you know need presidential seals of B1 level that can go up to 60 years under President Nixon, President Ford, President Carter, President Reagan, President Bush Sr., President Clinton, President Bush Jr., President Obama, and on and on. That's not normally someone that sells drugs. So 599 pages exist, and people would like to question. Here's the 2 pages they give you. This is all you will get on him, other than what I've found independently by myself from other resources. And so this one's dated 1982. This is when Michael is working with Paul Maraska across at Cabazon, Wackenhut, Cabazon Research Centre, and they're involved also with the Cabazon Casino and Cabazon Arms that's providing arms and training to Iran-Contra rebels. It's dated 1982. It's got a B1 classification with everything blocked out. Now remember, Michael's not charged on narcotics, but it's B1. This one's blocked out per CIA. B1, CIA, and that's 1982. The next one I can get on the following page is, this one says terrorism section. So have a think about that. Going right back to 1982, top secret, under B1 classification, which is presidential executive level, and felt that this was principally a narcotics matter. So is it possible that Michael is working on something that is involving narcotics, CIA, and it's so top secret that it happens to be during the period of Nugenhan Bank, Wackenhut, and the beginning of Iran-Contra? So there's 2 pages. This is the response when it was appealed. Patrick O'Shea made the application and was appealing. All he got was 2 pages out of 599 and wanted to get confirmation that they were not preventing him from getting access to this CIA file 201, which is very important, a 201 file on everything on Michael James Riconosciuto. And also, are there any internal memos, notes, faxes, computer data of CIA Director William Casey personally mentioning Michael Riconosciuto, Wackenhut Corporation, or the Wackenhut Indian Reservations? And this was their response. The agency, CIA, as you can see, it's got the seal of CIA, can neither confirm or deny the existence, which would reveal confidential or covert CIA connection. So I want you to go back and remember that B1 classification, CIA presidential, is a president sealing it, and it relates to narcotics and terrorism section. So this is what I found independently by going through huge archives, and eventually I found this. It's also dated April 82, and this was the time when Michael, if you look at my previous podcast, Michael Riconosciuto and Paul Maraska were assisting Michael Hand to launder the funds for Nugenhan Bank, which was linked to Wackenhut and Robert Booth Nichols' Meridian Arms International and Logistics International, which was linked to the Gambino Mafia running the Cabazon Casino, but also the board of Wackenhut and Wackenhut Research Centre and Cabazon Arms that is doing the development and training of the Iran-Contra rebels in the use of guns and night scopes. And in addition to that, Michael and Paul Maraskas have been intimately involved with the confidential banking of William Casey and Michael Hand and the bank. So down here, what's very important is that this time, this is so early back in time, but it says that enclosed for the identification of the division are 2 manila envelopes and 35 sheets of paper bearing financial account and transaction information at the Atlantic Bank and Trust Company and at Banca Perienti, Geneva, Switzerland. And it's in response to the evidence of a police investigation found at the residence of Paul Maraska following the discovery of Maraska's body, a murder victim. And Michael has always confirmed that John Phillips Nichols and Philip Arthur Thompson were involved in the murder of his business partner, Paul Maraska. So I asked Michael, is this the accounts they use for transferring the funds from Nukenham Bank out of Australia? And he said no. They're actually the accounts that relate to the October surprise payments. So, in my interviews with Michael Riconosciuto, this is categorically what he has told me. Robert Booth Nichols was the security leak responsible for the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103. It was Robert Booth Nichols and George Pender's daughter who changed the booking of the flights to ensure all members of the McKee team were all placed on the same flight, and that was in complete breach of the security policy for international travel. And so the relationship between George Pender and Robert Booth Nichols is on the board of FITCO with Robert Mayhew and Clint Murchison Jr. He also says in his interview, Ted Shackley's team were also selling cocaine, and they sold the radar detection systems to the Colombian drug lords to ensure their shipments could evade the drug interdiction program into the USA, Canada, and Australia. I have proven that in my analysis on the Department of Defence Command, Control, Communications and Intelligence system that they developed for the drug interdiction program called C3I. But independent of Michael, I interviewed Ari Ben-Menashe in 2004, and Michael never knew that I had interviewed him because he was providing evidence to me in interviews that Richard Babian travelled to Australia to deliver $6 million to Australian media baron Alan Bond, who made the airships with Westinghouse for the drug interdiction program contract managed by Peter Wiednieks. And this part's important. After I was talking to him at the very end, and this is a recorded interview I've got with him, he said Israel proved that they had successfully sold their modified PROMIS software to the Soviets when they arranged the demonstration of Matthias Rust, the German teenager, landing his plane in Moscow Red Square and totally undetected by the Soviet radar and missile defense system. This was the final proof the Soviets had been using our modified PROMIS software. And he said to me, we were sending them a message. If we can land a plane in Moscow Square, then don't mess around with Israel from this point forward. Now, that proves independently the link of Alan Bond and the airships, the aerostats, the radar systems for the aerostats and the radar systems for the AWACS was developed by the secret teams companies so they know how to avoid detection. I will have another podcast on overwhelming evidence that Danny Casolaro found the director, Dr. Joseph Navarro, who was on the board of the Defence Science Board with Charlie Allen, the CIA agent that was in Australia working with Ted Shackley and William Colby, and Robert Booth Nichols to bring down the Whitlam government, and with the partnership with the Guggenheim Bank. And he set up Rex 84, or Continuity of Government, Complete Fusion of Database Systems with Oliver North. So, in my podcasts, I have demonstrated that they developed all the intelligence fusion databases that allowed for the command C3I under the Office of Secretary of Defense control systems for the drug interdiction program of the aerostats and AWACS, radar tracking systems, including over-the-horizon radar tracking of submarines, planes and ships, so that they know how to help the cartels avoid detection for the drug interdiction program being managed by Vice President George Bush. Alan James Francevic, he produced 2 films, Gladio, which covered Operation Gladio. And I'll cover that because it relates to P2 Lodge, or the Knights of Malta, linking back to the Ambrosiano Bank, and its links with Ted Shackley, Alexander Hay, Michael Ledeen, William Casey, and all Knights of Malta who are going to be involved in this particular podcast as well. And more importantly, he also produced the Maltese Double Cross, which was revealing evidence that Pan Am Flight 103 was actually a CIA covert operation of drugs and involved in the switch of explosive onto the plane to bring down the McKee team. This part's mysterious. He was on his way back to the USA with evidence relating to Edwin Wilson, and also was planning to visit Michael Riconosciuto in prison. And he had a heart attack in the customs area of George Bush Intercontinental Airport in Houston, Texas, April 17, 1970, while entering the United States from England. Many parties believed that he was murdered, given that he was following the trail of the evidence that CIA was involved in the bombing of, when I say CIA, the secret team, Ted Shackley's secret team of rogue CIA agents and DIA agents and DE agents and NSA agents were involved in the cover-up of their illegal drug and arms operations worldwide. This article was published, Did Lockerbie Bombing Mastermind Work for the CIA? And this part's very important. It says here that Scottish forensic experts allegedly were able to trace the clothing that was in the suitcase containing the bomb to a clothing shop in the resort town of Salima, Malta. This shop was located directly across the street from the Malta offices of Ishvan Barghouti International. Although 2 Libyan intelligence officers were indicted for their role in the bombing, Barghouti, who was apparently being protected by US authorities until his death in July 1990, was never arrested. A year and a half after Barghouti's death, the 2 Libyan suspects were officially charged with the crimes. It then goes on to say the real mastermind in the Pan Am 103 terrorist bombing over Lockerbie, Scotland, which took the lives of more than 270 people, 2/3 of them Americans, may have been on the CIA payroll. The late Dr. Ishaq Barghouti exposed to the Israelis by former naval intelligence analyst Jonathan Pollard as the builder of the Rabata chemical weapons plant in Libya, was the conduit in the CIA's covert arming of Iraq with biochemical weapons as part of a scheme to ensure that Iraq would not lose its war with fundamentalist Iran. Barghouti had strong ties to Libyan strongman Muammar Gaddafi and has been linked to high-level Israeli intelligence sources to the Lockerbie tragedy. Friends of Barghouti in the United States were apparently allowing him to operate a plant in Boca Raton, Florida, that produced deadly cyanide to be exported to Iraq. So the evidence that I'm going to show you is that this overlaps Iran-Contra but also Iraq-Gate. It says here, according to Israeli intelligence sources, the work of Barghouti was first disclosed to Israeli intelligence officers by Pollard. They specify Pollard's turning over to Israel a classified study that included as an attachment a contract between Barghouti's company IBI and Jürgen Hippenstall Imhausen of the German company Imhausen Chemie. The contract dated October 1st, 1984, called for the design and construction of multi-purpose chemical plant at Rabta, Libya. It also says that former Libyan intelligence agent Abdel Basset al-Megrahi, who was head of operations for Libyan Arab Airlines in Malta, has been convicted after a 9-month trial for his role in the Flight 103 bombing. A panel of 3 Scottish judges acquitted al-Maghri's co-defendant, Lamin Khalifa Finima. What has never been revealed, however, was who gave the order to carry out the mission. And it goes on to say in May 1989, Hippenstall Imhausen was finally arrested by German authorities after intense pressure from the United States. Barghouti disappeared from West Germany, however, and resurfaced in England. After German authorities searched IBI's offices in Frankfurt, Barghouti, facing extradition from England to West Germany, then moved to the United States, where he lived as a free man for the remainder of his life. Nevertheless, both Imhausen Chemie and IBI had been named as the prime contractors of the Rabta plant, which US intelligence sources had identified as production facilities for the deadly nerve gases Torben and Sarin. The ABC Nightline segment, Saddam's Chemical Connection, also exposed Barghouti's connection to Boca Raton plant, which began operating in 1988. And as we go further, we're going to see that Hassan Ali, the author letter to Haydar Barghouti, would himself be indicted in Atlanta for his part in the Banca Nacional del Lavoro affair, BNL. This is Iraq-Gate. Was the Italian-owned bank with an office in Atlanta that secretly financed the Iraqi military buildup and using American Department of Agriculture loan guarantees. And I will show you that this will lead to the BCCI, BNL payments involving Kissinger and Associates and the secret team. And of course it says Abdul Senalsi, also mentioned in a letter that great names, Abdullah Senalsi, Deputy Director of Libyan Intelligence, brother-in-law of Gaddafi, and identified by both American and French authorities as one of the planners of the Pan Am 103 bombing. And then the last bits it says, but the coincidences do not end there. On October 27, 1990, almost 4 months after Barghouti's death during a time in which the United States was bracing for a possible war with Iraq, Raja Hassan Ali wrote a letter from Iraqi State establishment for textiles to IBI's offices in London. Hassan Ali marked the letter obtained from intelligence sources to the attention of Haider Barbouti, the late Ishbal Barboudi's son, and Ari David Haidar's Barbouti's Israeli-born attorney. The letter stated, "We expect the assistance that you promised to the enterprise for pesticide production. Additional supplies of raw materials will ensure future fundings by Foreign Minister Abdul Sanaousi knows our requirements." The investigation that followed the Pan Am 103 was aided meanwhile by the discovery of a small child's play suit from the suitcase that contained the explosive device. Investigators traced the play suit to the manufacturer Yorkie Clothing. Investigators were further able to trace the play suit to a small boutique, Mary's House, located at, and you're going to love this, 146 Tower Road in the tiny resort village of Selima, Malta. The store's owner identified the playsuit as one sold to an Arab gentleman on November 23, 1988, on a copy of an alleged contract between Barbouti and Imhausen Chemi. IBI's address in Selima, Malta is listed at 145 Tower Road, adjacent. So it looks like the evidence that's been covered up is that there seems to be a protected arms dealer selling chemical nerve gas and weapons to Libya and Iraq, who's protected by US intelligence, and we're going to show that it goes further than that. And it said, did Lockerbie bombing mastermind work for the CIA? And of course, it's going to go through the further evidence relating to that, explosives. It confirms the address. So the newspapers and investigators, credible ones, started to do further investigations on who Ishbal Barbouti was and his connections and his links and his production of cyanide nerve gas, setting up factories for Gaddafi and for Saddam Hussein. And what's his links with CIA? What's his links with other arms sanctioned deliveries to Libya and Iraq that could be used against American forces coming up to a Iran and Iraq war, but also when they invaded Kuwait, putting the lives of American soldiers and Allied forces at risk. And this is what they discovered. Donovan Seaton confirms he was introduced to Barbouti. He introduced Barbouti to former Air Force General Richard Secord. They were running a company called EMAW Inc. for explosive missiles and warheads. Also, the evidence was that Ishbal Barbouti had a relationship also in dealings with Carlos Ghosn for the cluster bombs that are being sold to Libya and also to Iraq. But more importantly, it was Richard Secord who introduced Barbouti to Wackenhut. And Wackenhut was providing all security for his arms companies and chemical factories for production of cyanide in the USA and productions in Libya and overseas, in England and Europe. And so now we have evidence of a direct link between Richard Secord, Ishbal Barbouti, but more important, it was Richard Secord who introduced Richard Barbouti to Wackenhut. So I have interviewed Jimmy Rothstein extensively. He investigated US customs evidence involving Peter Wiedniks and Michael Riconosciuto, particularly relating to the aerostat, AWAC, radar tracking systems contract that he was managing, and also the Insular PROMIS software contract that he was managing at Department of Justice, and applications at Customs, Justice and the Coast Guard with DEA. And he says he was financed by Alexander Magnus, the millionaire, to privately investigate disturbing evidence that his foundation was being exploited by Oliver North and Tom Posse, who was connected to the Ku Klux Klan, as a front to secretly finance their Iran-Contra arms and drug operations. This is a foundation being exploited by Oliver North. And of course, further investigations by Alexander Magnus was financing a book when they investigated the bombing of Oklahoma City bombing and links of a cover-up. And it turns out that they were making allegations that Oliver Buck Revel, retired FBI deputy director, was complaining about the allegations they were making that he had been tipped off about the bombing of Pan Am 103. The issue that he had a legal case against Alexander Magnus was an accusation of book that Buck Revel had advanced knowledge of the 1988 bombing of Pan Am 103, and that he had his son removed and daughter-in-law from Pan Am 103. And of course he lost the lawsuit. Now this is a wonderful article that did in-depth investigations into the relationship between Richard Secord and Ishbam Barbuti, considered one of the leading suspects involved with providing the bomb to bring down Pan Am 103 to kill the McKee team, returning with all their evidence that the secret team was involved in illegal drugs and arms trafficking. I've interviewed Margie Sloan extensively, who was one of the researchers, and she has shared with me her evidence and further evidence that I'm collaborating with her on the money laundering trail, sophisticated money laundering involving the secret team. And their investigation says that assisting Barbuti with these investments was New Orleans exporter Don Seaton, a business associate of Richard Secord, the right-wing US Army general turned war profiteer who was deeply enmeshed in the Iran-Contra affair. You need to remember that Danny Casolaro was receiving telephone calls routinely at home from Richard Secord. It was Richard Secord who connected Barbuti with Wackenhut. Barbuti met with Secord in Florida on several occasions, and phone records show that several calls were placed from Barbuti's office to Secord's private number in McLean, Virginia. Secord has acknowledged knowing Barbuti. The article also did the research about the relationship of Wackenhut with Secord, but also the fact that Michael Riconosciuto had been employed by Wackenhut and the research division, and that he knew George Wackenhut personally, and that he'd been employed, and that's where he modified the PROMIS software. And so it covers the story of Riconosciuto and says that he met with George Wackenhut and John Amaral, who were on the board and consultant to George Wackenhut in Las Vegas. Dr. John Philip Nichols, the former CIA agent and Wackenhut business partner who was running the shadowy activities on the Cabazon Indian Reservation in California desert. He also says that Ricono says that during their Vegas evening together, George Wackenhut asked how his work on the software was coming along. Such comments from a twice convicted fellow would normally be dismissed out of hand, but in an interview with Spy, Wackenhut's John Amaral confirmed that such a meeting did indeed take place in Las Vegas. He says, "I don't remember any specific conversations," Amaral said, "but I think we were there to discuss the sale of George's yacht, the top secret. I think Nichols said he had a potential buyer." Also, two former CIA operatives, separately interviewed, have explained that Chuck Hayes, who describes himself as a CIA asset, says Wackenhut was helping Barbuti ship chemicals to Iraq. He also says that Wackenhut was just in it for the money. And then another testimony comes from Richard Babian, the former CIA contract employee, confirmed Chuck Hayes' account. He says that Wackenhut's relationship with Barbuti existed before Boca Raton plant opened. And so Barbuti was placed in the hands of Secord by the CIA, and Secord called in Wackenhut to handle security, travel and protection for Barbuti and his export plans. Wackenhut, Babian says, was working for the CIA in helping Barbuti ship the chemical and nuclear weapons making equipment first to Texas, then to Chicago, and then to Baltimore to be shipped overseas. All of which makes the story of the midnight convoy ride of David Ramirez, recounted at the beginning of this article, rather less mysterious. Spy has learned that this shipment is now the subject of a joint US DA Customs, should be DEA, Customs investigation. And so they have given a nice summary about Dr. Ishram Barbuti, his links with Richard Secord, and the business and transactions that have taken place between all the parties. So this is independent verification that Iran-Contra and Iraq-Gate scandals involving Ishram Barbuti's and Carlos Cardone links with the CIA, with Wackenhut and the secret team is real. And it says here that Richard Babian, in the late 1989, Barbuti met in London with Ibrahim Sabawai, Saddam Hussein's half-brother and European head of Iraqi intelligence. And they were getting excited about a pipeline recovery contract that they're working on. And the owner of TK7 Company swears that Barbuti told him he was developing an atom device for Gaddafi. Barbuti also wanted ferrocyanide form product ingredient for his nerve gas production. Assisting Barbuti with these was New Orleans exporter Don Seaton, and confirming again a business associate of Richard Secord. And we've covered that he actually has records to show a relationship between Richard Secord and Ishram Barbuti and Wackenhut. So, a couple of things there are repeating. Telephone calls. So Spy article, and that was with Margie Sloan, has definitive evidence of interviews, witnesses that have been interviewed, financial transactions taking place between Barbuti and Wackenhut. Further evidence there, linking across to key people who end up working for Bill Clinton, Bush's office, and confirmation of a partnership on their contracts. And what was very interesting is that there was a venture that was being linked across by the parties involving former US Attorney General and Watergate felon John Mitchell and arms dealer Sarkis Soghlanlian, the Turkish-born Lebanese citizen. And of course, it's linking across to the arms dealers that have been identified in the affidavits provided by Richard Babian and also Ari Ben Menashe, witnessing Earl Bryan selling the PROMIS software to the Iraq military, where these arms dealers are present. It also is linking across to Gerald Bull with his gun and weapons development. And Michael Riconosciuto has indicated his business links with groups that were working with these people while he was at Wackenhut Research Centre. So we actually have a very detailed independent analysis being done. And this again is an article that's published. Former FBI official loses his legal fight, and I need you to remember that FBI Buck Revell claim is that he had advanced knowledge of the Pan Am airline bombing, and Revell personally pulled his son and daughter-in-law off the plane from the London airport. Now, if he's changed the flights and had knowledge, that is further evidence that CIA and FBI had been warned in advance before allowing the McKee team all put onto the same flight to continue with the flight that had the bomb. That links back to Ishmael Baboudi with his relationships with Wackenhut and with Richard Secord and the secret team. So let's now look at what research was Danny following. And in his files, previous podcasts have shown you that he was definitely researching the annual report of Wackenhut. He was very interested in the fact that Frank Colucci was appointed now as a director, and he knew that he was involved with the setup with the secret team to destroy the Whitlam government in Australia by setting up the $4 billion Arab loan. He also was investigating John Amaral, and he also uncovered evidence, overwhelming evidence, that Wackenhut was setting up their own anti-terrorism and crisis management division under Frank Colucci. He also had a copy of a confidential terrorist group report which had the profiles of all terrorists. This is very important. The intelligence on the terrorists is accessible for their private counter-terrorism and assassination team. These are photographs from the annual report of their training facilities to counter terrorism, but this is what caught my attention. In further response to the rise in terrorism, our inspectors are assigned to screen hold luggage before it can be loaded aboard planes at some airports. They also are on guard possible smuggling of narcotics aboard US-bound aircraft from some overseas locations and at London's Heathrow Airport, for example. Wackenhut security personnel have the additional responsibility of guarding the high-value air shipments as they are moved from one plane to another. This is a smoking gun. They also confirm that they're selected in 1985 by Pan Am World Airways for full security services in the New York area, resulted in a single largest airline contract yet concluded by the company. Aside from Pan Am Worldport Terminal at John F. Kennedy International Airport, Wackenhut also provides security for airlines headquarters buildings in New York City and its computer centres across Hudson River. The upsurge in international terrorism also impacted TWC's Executive Protection Division, which provides one of the most highest vital services for high-profile executives and their family. Wackenhut specialists in the division have long experience in giving business protection from abduction, extortion and criminal attack. This is overwhelming evidence that the security for Pan Am Flight 103 and Heathrow Airport for the transfer of all luggage is the responsibility of Wackenhut before Pan Am 103 came down. It also goes on and says they are responsible for the screening of passengers, 100 airlines at 65 airports across the United States plus other overseas. Wackenhut PDS examine carry-on luggage with X-ray equipment and screen passengers as they pass through magnetometers. Wackenhut Checkpoint Security Supervisor also on duty at many airports during the year, serving as backups as PDS inspectors. They also provide support for airport patrols and improving terminal security. Now this would have been missed by most people, but this relationship between Richard Secord, Ishbaan Barbuti and Wackenhut, and allegations that the bomb was in a bag with child's clothing purchased at the building adjacent to Ishbaan Barbuti's company in Malta and was placed onto the airport, flown from Malta to Frankfurt and then put on the plane. With all travel, with the connecting flights of the McKee team all boarding Pan Am 103 at Heathrow against breaching all international travel security. You never have all executives of large multinational companies on one plane. In case it goes down, you lose all your top level management. And the same with investigation and intelligence. You wouldn't put them all on one plane to be a simple target. So, Danny had uncovered the relationship of Wackenhut with Pan Am and Heathrow Airport. He also had uncovered confidential evidence that Wackenhut directors were setting up their own private counter-terrorism and consultants company with the who's who, but particularly Dr. Joseph Navarro, responsible for the war on drugs and interdiction program involving aerostats and AWAC radar tracking systems. Dr. John Motley, who was intimately involved with Vice President's task force for fighting terrorism and drugs, and he was Vice President of Wackenhut's Advanced Technology Centre, whereas Dr. Joseph Navarro was the President. And of course, Dwayne Claridge was helping them set up a private counter-terrorism consultants group, and he'd been the chief and founder of the Counter-Terrorism Consultants Centre for CIA. There was the proof in previous podcasts. This is a document that no one has other than Danny. Danny Casolaro had it. There's the resume in the document for Dr. Motley, who was former ambassador, and on the President's Task Force for Combating Terrorism, who had access to all the confidential intelligence with Dwayne Claridge, with the secret team. And there's the resume of Dwayne Claridge, which they left his name off. But when you do the analysis of the profile where they've deliberately left the name off, is that he's in the process of retiring from CIA to head up this private group. Danny was also working intimately with Robert Bickle and his investigations that were tracking the illegal transfer of technologies and the illegal sales of weapons of mass destruction to Libya and Iraq, and their links with the secret team. These are the reports. There's volumes of it. I've just cut out the most important thing, is that Robert Bickel was expressing serious concerns that there's a cover-up of sales of chemical weapons and nuclear technologies to Iraq and Libya involving the secret team of Ted Shackley, Richard C. Cord, and rogue CIA elements, particularly Ishram Barghouti and Gerald Bull and Carlos Ghosn. Later on, this is a testimony and affidavit given by Howard Teacher in support of the US trying to prosecute Carlos Ghosn, where he confirms categorically. He says, "This is my deposition to support Carlos Ghosn." Howard Teacher, Reagan National Security Council official. Ghosn was working for CIA to illegally ship military hardware to Saddam. This is sanctioned. It was the part of the deals involving the Department of Agriculture Commodity Credit Corporation, funded by BNL, and also the failed BCCI Bank, known as the Bank of Crooks and Criminals International, had connections to both BNL and also Ahmed Chalabi's Petrobank. George W. Bush and Jeb Bush had been named as potential witnesses in the class action lawsuit brought about the clients of BCCI, who had been defrauded in the bank's collapse. During the time, George W. was involved in various failed oil companies in Houston, and Jeb, operating from a base in Miami, was involved in suspicious real estate deals. This is an affidavit to help Carlos Ghosn. Between 1990 and 1991, 3 journalists were investigating various aspects of Ghosn's secretive arms trading activities were found dead in suspicious circumstances. And he states, they were freelance writer Danny Casolaro, found dead from the wrist slashes in bathtub in Martinsburg, West Virginia hotel. Lawrence Ning, a stringer for the Financial Times, found shot to death in a bathtub of his apartment in Guatemala City. And Jonathan Moyle, a British aviation journalist, found hanging in a closet of his hotel room in Santiago, Chile. Moyle had uncovered details of Ghosn's role in the Bush 41 deal to illegally ship weapons to Iraq. Michael Riconosciuto's business partners and research associates, Monty Alexander, who I've interviewed, and also his research associate, provided Danny with copies of Michael's files containing his partnerships with Carlos Ghosn at Wackenhut Research Center and Hercules Research, which describes the brochures of the cluster bombs manufactured by Carlos Ghosn. Michael has confirmed in his interviews with me, recorded interviews, that when Carlos Ghosn first graduated from university, he worked for his father, Marshall Riconosciuto. They were friends, and he was continuing his relationship in research and development with Carlos Ghosn. So it substantiates the reason why Michael's files are classified B1 presidential top secret, B2 and B3, given that Michael has been involved in confidential, sanctioned arms development and anti-terrorism activities. And from it, it goes through the details and specifications. In addition to that, Monty Alexander confirmed that in the safe and safekeeping for Michael for his records were the brochures for the top nuclear missiles and warheads, the sales brochures. And he states quite categorically, if Michael's just a simple drug manufacturer, who do you know has access to the sales brochures on the top nuclear missiles? His wife also, in her interview with us, said that when customs raided Michael's house and took all of his equipment, his mining and processing equipment and everything that belonged to them, they took the photograph that was signed by the Admiral on one of the nuclear missile launches from a submarine, personally signed for Michael. Michael was working with Hercules Research, which was involved in the research for the booster rockets as well. Danny Casolaro had written on the card, he had linked the BCCI transactions in England to Abu Nidal, the world-leading terrorist, and linking the Tampa, Florida customs investigation that arrested the BCCI officials involved in money laundering Noriega's drugs, and he says this is the channel money. Two weeks before Danny dies, the auditors of BCCI in London confirm that they've uncovered from French Secret Service intelligence documents reported that Kuwait Embassy in London paid the funds into a London BCCI account of terrorist leader Abu Nidal in 1987. The report was among the latest accusations of covert or shadowy dealings linked to BCI, which closed operations in dozens of countries in July 5th. This is July 25th, 2 weeks before Danny dies, 1991. After the Bank of England received what it described as evidence of huge fraud. The Guardian story said the French report alleges that Abu Nidal's BCCI account was in the name of Samir Najmuddin, described as the head of Fatah Revolutionary Council's commercial network. The article said that Najmuddin is an Iraqi businessman who supplied arms to Saddam Hussein and to Argentina during the Falklands War. So Danny Casolaro had access to the smoking gun, the signed BCCI checks by Khashoggi and Gorbanifar going through the bank of BCCI's bank in Monte Carlo. That part's very important. Also, this was provided to me by Bill Hamilton, was a letter that was provided to him about a transfer of the PROMIS software with a special data retrieval unit. And this part's very important. Everyone keeps talking about PROMIS being software that's got a backdoor, but it doesn't work unless you have a special data retrieval unit where the technology, I understand, Michael understands, is hooked up for retrieval by the Echelon satellites. It's not a standard backdoor like a cable going through the internet or Wi-Fi with the internet. It's actually broadcasting hidden information in the floor of noise that can only be detected by high-level physics and mathematics and equipment that I'm familiar with. My background's in physics and spectroscopy, signal processing, image processing, and particularly in diffraction physics. And so it turns out that this is more revealing than anything else. But it had in it the name Manager Gorbanifar, Adnan Khashoggi, Richard Armitage, and Sheikh Khalid Mahfouz, who was the biggest equity holder in BCCI. So this was part of a deal, and it's dated May 1985. And the important thing now is the checks are dated 1985. The deal for the PROMIS software with special device for them, given they're involved in the Iran-Contra deal to free the hostages is involving the same date. And so the dates of 1985 for the signing of the first channel of opening up the Iran-Contra deal for arms exchange for hostages involving Ted Shackley and his business partner from TGS International, together with Khashoggi and Gorbanifar, is critical evidence as a smoking gun on Danny is exposing the secret team. And so what we're doing now is that his investigations was right back to bringing down the Whitlam government in Australia, October surprise, Iran-Contra, drugs and arms, money laundering through Nugenham Bank, BCCI, and now we're linking the same team, the secret team, the same group involved in all of those crimes are also linked to the bombing of Pan Am 103. As we proceed with evidence, let's see if by chance you could throw a dice and line the ducks up to show that it was the same team. We know that Danny was a threat to Ted Shackley. During the investigation into was there evidence that there was a motive to kill Danny, his best friend George Pittaway, gave a testimony to the detective George Schwartzwood, and this is in his handwriting. Danny and George Pittaway met Ted Shackley's girlfriend on July 1991. And they took her home to Danny's house and they found her going through all of Danny's research work, And also in addition to that, they gave the name and the number of Danny's new girlfriend who was paid $10,000 to stay with the Crown Prince and Prime Minister of Kuwait at Watergate Hotel. And they never contacted her. Why would Danny be meeting with Ted Shackley's girlfriend, and why was she interested in his evidence when found secretly going through his papers? He was a threat to Ted Shackley and his secret team. So we have overwhelming evidence when you go through the research and the reports and the investigation reports and articles about the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103. There are several theories that suggest that the US Central Intelligence Agents had set up a protected drug route from Europe to United States, allegedly called Operation Korea, that allowed Syrian drug dealers led by Monza al-Qassar, who was involved with Oliver North in the Iran-Contra scandal, to ship heroin to the United States using Pan Am flights. This was a routine, protected, sanctioned CIA delivery of heroin in exchange for payments for arms and for hostages, so-called deal. The CIA allegedly protected the suitcases containing these drugs and made sure they were not searched. On the day of the bombing, as the theory goes, terrorists exchanged suitcases, one with drugs for one with a bomb. So the evidence is going back to a protected arms dealer selling chemical weapons and weapons of mass destruction to Gaddafi and Iraq, sanctioned and protected by CIA and Wackenhut and the secret team, was involved with the transfer of this bomb from Malta to Pan Am to bring down McKee's team. Time magazine introduced another version of the theory, claiming that American intelligence officers on Pan Am Flight 103, Matthew Gannon of CIA and Major Charles McKee of the DIA, had found out about the drug operation and were headed to Washington to raise their concerns about its impact on their hostage rescue plans. Juval Aviv, who's former Mossad, introduced a variation of his story. He was the owner of Interfor Inc., a private investigation company based in Madison Avenue, New York. Aviv claimed to be a former Mossad officer who led the Operation Wrath of God team that assassinated members of the Black September who were believed to have been responsible for the Munich massacre in 1972. Please remember Black September, because in a future podcast I'll show you that the Mossad agent and assassin that worked on Black September also was linked to Roy Frankhauser from the Ku Klux Klan, who was sent by Henry Kissinger on a secret mission for NSC to work with them. And I will prove to you in another podcast that Roy Frankhauser from the Ku Klux Klan was working with Paul Lear Alexander, both of them for CIA, to ship cocaine into the USA and Australia, $8 billion over nearly 15 years, hidden in Siemens transformers, sanctioned by CIA and the secret team, and using BCCI accounts. And in fact, my podcast will also review real evidence to you that Roy Frankhauser from the Ku Klux Klan not only had worked as an undercover FBI agent, informer, but also NSC, had an office in Langley working with Dwayne Claridge's Counter-Terrorism Centre, and is attending meetings in the office of Oliver North in White House with Paul Lear Alexander. So there seems to be a link here of the evidence coming forward, and according to his theory, so having worked at a high level in intelligence with Mossad, he became aware and that parties involved, according to his theory, that CIA knew in advance that the baggage exchange would take place, but let it happen anyway because the protected drugs route was a rogue operation. And Gannon and McKee were on their way to Washington to tell their superiors about it. That supports the evidence of Michael, that Robert Booth Nichols and George Pender and the secret team knew about the bomb being placed on Pan Am 103, and they ensured that the whole team was on that flight and remained on that flight. Yet FBI agent Buck Revell had advance warning to remove his son and daughter-in-law from Pan Am 103 flight booking. So let's continue with, is it possible that this secret team was involved in the bombing of Pan Am 103, given that their drug and arms business and operations, illegal drugs and arms, being laundered through BCCI at this time, linked with Wackenhut, linked with Barbuti and Carlos Cadone and Wackenhut, with the responsibility of security and ensuring that all luggage is free of bombs. Did they have a motive to bring it down? And is there overwhelming evidence that the secret team are the parties involved above, based on the evidence from the following parties? Michael had stated categorically that Fidco was an NSC cutout. George Pender, Robert Mayhew, Robert Booth Nichols. This is a nasty bunch of people, and they're still alive and well. Now, where that dovetails into my current situation is in 1984, I was involved with Robert Booth Nichols, who owns Meridian Arms Operation and is a principal in FIDCO. The CEO of FIDCO is George Pender, Robert Mayhew. FIDCO was an NSC corporate cutout and was created to be a corporate vehicle to secure financing for the reconstruction cities of Beirut and Damour in Lebanon. And they were working out of an office in Nicosia, Cyprus. As covered in podcasts, George Pender was brought to California to work personally for Howard Hughes. Robert Mayhew was also working personally for Howard Hughes. Clint Murchison, William Pender was CIA station chief in Saigon. Robert Booth Nichols on the same board of all these people, and he's known to have links with CIA, Mafia, Yakuza, and the meddling cartels, money laundering drugs, and running an arms company. And of course, Michael McManus Jr., their attorney. I have the legal court cases of him representing them with their oil pipes deals in Libya under Gaddafi. Also, letters, he gets appointed as personal legal counsel to President Reagan. So he's in the office as the personal legal advisor to the president himself. We've covered the resumes of all these people, and quite clearly, each of them, with the empire of Howard Hughes behind them, are intimately linked to CIA, NSA, FBI. This is a letter of correspondence directly with Robert Booth Nichols. It's dated 1983 at the time when he's working with Wackenhut and Cabazon, Casino Cabazon Arms, and deals in Australia with Michael Riconosciuto and John Philip Nichols. But the book, The Octopus, that tried to look at the records of Danny Casolaro based on information at the time. It says, in 1976, Robert Booth Nichols represented a Saudi company, Ali and Fahd, and in failed attempt to acquire Howard Hughes's company, Suma Corporation, after the death of the reclusive magnate. 8. Joseph Scipio, later taken as hostage in Lebanon. Do you like this? He's one of the hostages held in Lebanon. Was an employee also of Ali and Fahd, and at the time, and stated that Nichols represented himself as an agent for the US government in the takeover bid. So Scipio said that Nichols showed him Justice Department identification and had information which he assumed could only have been acquired through government contacts. Now I want to bring to your attention, FIDCO is responsible, working directly with the Prime Minister and government of Lebanon through the 70s and 80s, and has huge billion-dollar aid projects for the reconstruction of Lebanon. But at the same time, they're down there involved in rescuing hostages, particularly Robert Booth Nichols, George Pender, together with Michael Riconosciuto. And there's a story of Joseph Scipio. He was captured in 1986 and remained a hostage right up to 1991. He was there for a very long time, and he's one of the hostages that is Charlie McKee's team is trying to rescue. But isn't it interesting that he refused to sell the company to Robert Booth Nichols, and he's taken hostage? But most important, Robert Booth Nichols is intimately involved in matters in Lebanon and Middle East. Remember, we had him directly linked with Nugenham Bank, with the drugs and mafia, with SHACKLEY's secret team and Michael Hand, going back to the dismissal of the Australian Prime Minister Gough Whitlam. Cherie Seymour, in her book The Last Circle, which is based on the documents that she got from Michael Riconosciuto's wife, she states the history of Robert Booth Nichols, reportedly in Vietnam, working for a wealthy US businessman in the private sector. During recent Valentine's Day interview at Holmes, Nichols' close friend and former businessman, it was revealed that Nichols worked as a contract operative for NSC at the time of Danny's death. Nichols had been on the board of directors of First International Development Corporation, FIDCO, also reportedly a NSC cutout used in Lebanon to arrange the release of the prisoners, or the hostages. Letters written in the summer of '83 between FIDCO directors Michael McManus, then Assistant to President Ronald Reagan, at the White House, to George Pender, President of FIDCO, established FIDCO had an important role to play in Lebanon. So this is very, very important. A follow-up letter dated July 12, 1983 from Pender to Amin Gaimial, the President of Lebanon, indicated that all transactions should be telex to 652483 RBN Associates, LSA. That's Robert Booth Nichols. Nichols' telex address at his Marina del Rey condo in California. The bank then states the Arab Bank Limited in Amman, Jordan, responded that there would be no problem taking care of the US $3 billion or more financial transaction. The release of the prisoner was successful. So you are looking at 1983 that the board of FIDCO is involved in funds, finance involving White House, FIDCO board for reconstruction and aid, and their assistance in helping them locate some hostages. At the time that FIDCO was arranging the release of the prisoner in Lebanon, Robert Booth Nichols was under investigation by Los Angeles FBI as a suspect international laundering of money derived from narcotics and organised crime activities. An FBI report obtained by Nichols through special contacts and provided to his friend indicated Nichols' telex number was 652483, the same as sent to the President of Lebanon. Isn't this interesting? Then in August 1994, she did, however, manage to obtain 3 significant letters with the signatures of Michael A. McManus and George Pender on them. The following letters on FIDCO confirm its presence in Lebanon. Letter number 1, written on White House letterhead stationery, dated 29th, 1983, from Michael A. McManus, Assistant to President Reagan, to George K. Pender, Santa Monica, California. Dear George, it was good to see you again. I appreciate the update you and your associates gave me concerning the status of your efforts in rebuilding of Lebanon. Without question, FIDCO seems to have considerable role to offer, particularly in the massive financial participation being made available to the government of Lebanon. As you are aware, the United States government is providing financial aid. We are very interested in the success of rebuilding effort in Lebanon. I will appreciate your continuing to keep me posted. Best personal regards, sincerely, Mike McManus, Assistant to the President. So this is confirming what Michael is saying is their direct link to White House and the President at the highest level for George Pender. It's interesting to note that in 1982, 1 year before the above letter was written, Israel invaded Lebanon in a bid to crush the PLO strongholds there and install the Gemayel family in power. At the time, Tel Aviv was supporting the ultra-right Christian Phalange militia. Now, this part's going to now make sense to you with my evidence coming up. It is a far ultra-right Christian militia group, and then we're going to have a far-right Christian group from the US involved in the Iran-Contra hostages and drug deals for Lebanon and Iran. It was the Christian Phalangist militia which first brought Lebanon into the heroin trade. And so this is very important. The secret team seems to always be involved in the centres of heroin, drugs, cocaine, with many of the top national security operations that are covert. And the powerful Christian Gemayel family, which led to the way turning to outside forces for money, guns and political support. Foremost among the sources was the international heroin trafficking network. So I'm pulling out of all these books the key parts that I think are critical that gives you a synopsis very quickly. And then it goes on and confirms that there were many judicial committee hearings that learned that Sami al-Khoury, the Gemayel's chief of finances, was importing raw Turkish opium into Lebanon when it was processed into heroin, then shipped to Sicily for re-export throughout America and Europe. So this is the links of the drug trade back to the Gambino Mafia. Al-Khoury controlled the Gemayel family shipping lines, their trucking, air freight companies. He controlled the Lebanese wing of the French Connection for drugs, the wing that continued to do business with Sicilians in a bid to propel the Gemayel family to power. And it says here, after Israeli invasion, the Lebanese parliament elected to the presidency Bechir Gemayel, who had long been on the CIA payroll. But before he could take office, Bashir was killed by an assassin's bomb, and Bashir's brother Amin was installed as the president. So this is going back to the early 70s and now through the 80s. FIDCO, founded in 1972, is already on the ground, intimately involved in the development of oil production projects with Gaddafi in Libya, and now is the front leader for the reconstruction of Lebanon after the war with Israel. And then this letter, written on FIDCO letterhead stationery, dated July 12, 1983, from George K. Pender, to President of FIDCO, to President Amin Gemayel, President Palace, Beirut, Lebanon. Dear Mr. President, I had visited Beirut in February and May 1983 to discuss FIDCO participation in the redevelopment of Lebanon. These meetings were held with the Germans Maurice Ghanem and Mourid Baroudi. Apologies for pronunciation. Of particular interest is the fact that FIDCO offered to arrange the financing projects considered, provided they were in the government sector. Unfortunately, response to date is dragging, and a golden opportunity for Lebanon is slowly dying. So it goes through, I won't do the rest, but it's going through that he's trying to get the approval processes going for this reconstruction. And he says, I understand you will be at the White House on July 22nd. Would it be possible for me to meet with you in Washington, D.C. on July 21st, briefly, so that I may personally present our interests in Lebanon? As per copy attached letter, the White House is actively interested in our efforts. For your personal information, I was a good friend of Bashir. I was with him in Beirut in 1976 when the Syrian army came into police. When he later visited the United States on speaking tour, my wife and I went to Massachusetts to meet with him, and I miss him tremendously. I would appreciate your reply as soon as possible. You can reach me via telex, and again, italics 652483, Robert Booth Nichols Associates. Thank you for your time and consideration. Sincerely, George K. Pender. It appears that the opportunity in Lebanon for communications is through Robert Booth Nichols with his links with the Gambino Mafia, with the Mafia cartel in Lebanon. I've included here some slides just to let you know that independent research and articles that identify that the Christian Phalangist militia have been intimately identified as the key producers of heroin, but I thought this part was important. As these words have been recorded in December 1970, Al-Karuri was meeting in Israel with another prominent old age pensioner. His name was Meir Lansky, the late chief banker of the syndicate. It was merely a visit to old friend, said DEA officials. This goes back to Meir Lansky and his link with Israel intelligence and with CIA and the mafia distribution of drugs with the intelligence agencies. By pulling out key parts in here, it is quite clear US Beirut Embassy in 1971, DEA considered engaging Al-Karuri as one of its own agents. Now, remember, the allegation is that couriers of drugs had free pass in delivering their drugs into USA, the heroin, in exchange for arms and the release of hostages, sanctioned by CIA and will not be inspected by customs. Sanctioned deliveries. And this has been going on for many years, and Pan Am was the delivery vehicle. As you can see, there is a history that is leading the drugs, the heroin, into Italy and into the US with the mafia, but with the backing of Meir Lansky. It then says that in 1978, Al-Karuri set up Nuremberg. This one's important. It's a company, it's an arms dealing company, and where does he set it up? In Kuwait. And this is close to the time when Shackley is forced out of CIA, and he sets up TGS International, arranged by George Sr. Bush, when he was director of CIA, opened the doors for Ted Shackley to have business opportunities direct with the Kuwait royal family. And so for this part of the podcast, it's quite clear that not only was he selling drugs as the main supplier for heroin from Becker Valley, he's actually got his own arms company, which is sanctioned drugs in exchange for arms trafficking operations paid by the drugs, sanctioned and protected by CIA, Ted Shackley's secret team. All leading back to Kuwait for the arms and business opportunities in Kuwait with Ted Shackley's companies. And so right through here, not only is he selling arms, but in June 2nd, 1979, a shipment of 840 kilograms of heroin was packed in Pakistan, transported to the Nuremberg company in Kuwait. So he's now using that company in Kuwait right up in 1980 for now being the vehicle for arms for drugs and drugs for arms deals through Kuwait. So Kuwait is becoming the vehicle, and this is very, very important because all the evidence is the founders of BCCI, the directors were linked to the Kuwait royal family, and they financed the BCCI checks for the Iran-Contra arms for hostage deal. It involves Kuwait, and that's where Ted Shackley's companies are set. Key business is in Kuwait. There's also protection of their network, which is frustrating the authorities in many countries, is that he's being protected. They can't prosecute him. Anyone involved in deals with him suddenly has suicided. He's involved in the supply of AK-47s to sell for the Afghani rebels. This is what Ted Shackley's secret team wants to do. It wants to buy all the captured weapons from the PLO to provide to the Afghan rebels, but also to the Iran-Contras. That was the deal. The whole deal with Iran-Contra is that they're going to buy all of the weapons captured from the PLO, and they're going to be trading it through his company, which is based in Kuwait. It turns out that it's already indicating that DEA was trying to recruit him as an informer. So we have a conflict of interest here. He's a protected informer. He's protected by CIA, DEA, and involved in transporting heroin into the USA. That's not going to be inspected, and the routine is it's on Pan Am flights. And this is leading up to Pan Am 103. A great book, The Lebanese Connection, Corruption, Civil War, International Drug Trade by Jonathan Marshall. Very good book when you go through this. It shows the history of Guri being protected, and so he is the Lebanese drug king, and that has to be Robert Booth's man, Nichols' man, with the Fitco board. And it shows that he had a relationship in protection with Mossad and CIA in exchange for intelligence and also for his drugs, financing these sales of weapons that are being captured by the Israelis from the PLO that CIA desperately wants to get their hands on. Richard Secord, Ted Shackley are all wanting to get these arms with Oliver North to provide to the Iran-Contra rebels. As you go through, there's a history of known narcotics dealer, and as I go further, I found the links. His protege was Ahmed Youssef, I think it's Webby, in 1974, and he was linked directly to the Nugan Bank. So the heroin coming out of Lebanon from the same cartels is with Michael Hand, Richard Secord, going through Nugan Bank with Robert Booth Nichols, and all the way back to the Cabazon Casino and the arms links with Wackenhart. As you can see, it went right through the 70s into the early 80s. And this wonderful report, and I read the report here, the article about the link back to Nugan drugs, and it does check out because I then went into the newspapers and I was able to find the evidence of who was providing it, and it was a director of Nugan Bank with Michael Hand and Frank Nugan. And let me prove that to you. So basically they're tracking all of his arms and drugs, kilos of heroin, banks of Switzerland to Los Angeles are being tracked. The Swedes were frustrated. They discovered that he was biggest supplier of heroin and so-called Shoemaker League, and the Swedish police could not capture him. And to their surprise, the US Department of Drugs and Enforcement Agency, DEA, were never cooperative with their investigations. He was protected. He had huge shipments of hashish and heroin to Denmark, and he was Mr. Untouchable. So this is independent evidence to show how important the drug channel for heroin from Lebanon was for Ted Shackley, Robert Boot Nichols, George Pender, Robert Mayhew in their operations as a secret team. And so it says here, after years of disappointment, the Danish police suddenly received a telegram from DEA in November 1981. They can't find him. They want him to find it. So they provided telephone numbers for them to bug. And they did. So the Americans are now looking for him. He had smuggled 7 tons of hashish to New York. They knew he was in Brussels. DEA provided his telephone numbers. For a year, the phones were tapped, providing ample information about the international activities of the network. But the DEA asked the Danes to withhold any action against the Danish branch of the network and allow him to continue trafficking his drugs. And then in the late summer of 1982, they said he sent 22 truckloads of hashish from Lebanon to Europe. But then, according to an unnamed police source, a huge PLO drug ring had been exposed, involving a PLO banker and naming him as Ahmed Wabi. Now, this story was obvious disinformation. They say that he was certainly no PLO banker. In fact, he was the Christian Phalangist militia group. A former high-ranking police officer married to the daughter of the well-known Lebanese Phalangist politician. The bank, they're going to love this, the bank behind him was the Nugenhan Bank. And according to the Australian Commission report on Nugenhan Bank, Wiebe was a client of George Thomas Shaw. And I'll prove to you, but George Thomas Shaw was a director of Wackenhut, of Nugenhan Bank, with Michael Hand and Frank Nugen. And so you now can find the complete link from Lebanon going through to Fidco with Robert Boot Nichols. Here's the channel for the heroin. And as you can see, the biggest reconstruction financing contract between White House, Fidco, and the government of Lebanon is the contact numbers, are the telex numbers of Robert Boot Nichols. And so this article quite clearly shows that there is a far-right Christian militia group in Lebanon, and it's going to prove to you that it's involved in drugs. It's linked to the secret team, Fidco board, Shackley, and Secord, and the Nugenhan Bank, and BCCI, and then it's involved in arms trade through Kuwait with their companies based in Kuwait. And so I will show you how important this arms company in Kuwait is, the supply of arms captured by the PLO, from the PLO by the Israelis, that are being sold and purchased by Richard Secord, Oliver North and Ted Shackley's secret team using the financing of heroin sanction shipments coming out on Pan Am flights to America with the Gambino Mafia. And again, key person is Robert Boot Nichols, who was all over Danny Casolaro, exposing the octopus with its links with drugs and illegal arms. And so eventually it says here that several parties are arrested in Cyprus, caught with 1,000 kilograms of hashish onto Swedish freighter and smuggling 2.5 tons of hashish and 1.7 kilograms of heroin into Denmark. So we now have a history that this protected group with links with Fidco Robert Booth Nichols' secret team Ted Shackley is causing frustration of investigations of not just Lebanon, but not just Europe, not just England, not just America, but Australia as well with the Nugan Bank. And there's a picture of him, April 1985. He's released from prison in Cyprus, and the dropping of extradition request by the Denmark authorities, and his return to the Lebanon. And this is what it says. Ahmed Wehbi was suddenly released from jail in April 1985 and returned to Lebanon a completely free man. And it says down below that the newspapers had uncovered that the real explanation was the Danish government had been under pressure from the CIA for months to drop the demand for Wehbi. The CIA had suddenly found Wehbi useful again because of his connections in troubled Lebanon and other parts of the Middle East. The Danish government gave in, and another Nugan Bank client was in business again. There's the newspapers that I tracked down. Our drug investigation authorities had identified that, and you're going to like it, Nugan International Bank, Mr. Frank Nugan, talked of paying $10,000 to anyone who could set up the New South Wales Attorney General, Mr. Frank Walker, in a scandal, just like they did with the loans affair to destroy the Whitlam government. According to the documents, Mr. Nugan told a former director of the bank, Mr. George Thomas Shaw, that it would be ideal if we could establish that there was a relationship between the New South Wales Attorney General, Mr. Walker, and the PLO. Don't you like that? The documents was a statement by Mr. Shaw. Now this is the Mr. Shaw who's handling all the heroin coming from Lebanon with the Christian militia group who are supplying all the heroin and drugs into Australia. They tried to set up a secret Swiss account as a scandal because the New South Wales Attorney General is trying to have them prosecuted in 1982. You're going to like this. Then our investigators then found the director of Nugan Bank, Mr. George Thomas Shaw, to arrange $260,000 transferred. He starts singing like a bird. He's going to be prosecuted for being involved in laundering drugs through Nugan Bank with Michael Hand and Frank Nugan, and then he reveals all the evidence of the payments by all the drug cartels from Asia and Lebanon going through the Nugan Bank. And this now is further evidence going back to Lebanon drug suppliers with links to Fidco board and particularly Robert Booth Nichols. And then goes in details about George Shaw's groups and the laundering and identifies who those carriers were and suppliers of the heroin from Lebanon were, and they're the same people identified in the Danish reports. So that independently validates that Pan Am 103 is exposing sanctioned CIA heroin shipments to Australia and the USA through the Nugan Bank originally and will continue through BCCI. Linked to Robert Booth Nichols and the Fidco board and CIA. Now, in my interview with Jimmy Rothstein, he states that Wackenhut was setting up their own private counter-terrorism secret assassination team. Jimmy Rothstein confirmed to me categorically that yes, Alexander Magnus and Jimmy Rothstein were also speaking to Gene Wheaton, who confirmed that Oliver North and FBI Director Oliver Buck Raval were using Richard Secord, CIA operatives and Wackenhut to set up their own counter-terrorism and secret assassination team. And the important word is here is now Wackenhut. Now, I'm going to show you independent evidence that serendipitously Daniel Sheen came across during his Christic Institute prosecution of the secret team involved in illegal drugs, but also assassinations of political leaders, of governments, as part of his prosecution of Richard Secord, Ted Shackley, Albert Hakim, and Thomas Clines, and John Singlaub, and other parties. And this is what I found in the newspaper. During his investigations into the secret team's involvement with Iran-Contra, he discovered there was a link between Overseas Press Service, Inc., an Atlanta-based freelance news-gathering organisation with ties to Singlaub, and a warehouse with a ton of C4 explosives found in Atlanta. And it was linked to Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, now under indictment with Iran-Contra case. Now, this is serendipitous, and I'm going to show you that this evidence now validates the evidence that Danny Casolaro was investigating and proves that the secret team was involved in these activities and were involved in the Pan Am 103 bombing. During his investigations, Danny exposed that in summer 1984 that he talked to FBI agents about Overseas Press. This is a police officer by the name of Nixon, denied it, but this is what was uncovered, because observed there was absolutely nothing going on at the company, which coincidentally was located in the same building as Nixon's police office. Now remember, Danny Casolaro has exposed a secret counterterrorism and assassination team involving Dwayne Claridge, directors of Wackenhut, but also the attorneys responsible for prosecuting Edwin Wilson, Frank Turple, and investigating all the assassinations of the leaders of Chile and the bombings and hostages. So there's a huge conflict of interest, a cover-up, if they're involved in these secret team sanctioned heroin trafficking in exchange for arms and hostages. That was a threat when discovered by Charlie McKean's team. And the head of Overseas Press was W. Dennis Soot, had told him of trips to Nicaragua and somewhere down there. Nixon said he decided to check whether the FBI had anything on the company. So it's already got an independent verification that it's involved with Nicaragua. Soot denied Thursday that his now defunct company was involved with Contra Supply Network explosives and was investigated by local federal authorities. He said he knew North and Singlaub personally through his years as freelance news photographer, specialising in combat coverage. The Christic Institute, of course, had filed civil suit in 1986 claiming the secret team of former military and CIA had been involved in political assassinations, drug smuggling, gun running and other crimes since early 1960s, most recently in Central America. And then goes on to say the Atlanta links in the Contra Supply Network, including a report, there's a ton of explosives discovered in a warehouse in 1984. So there's denial, but that's as far as it goes. But it also said the suit, which seeks $22 million damages from 29 defendants, is scheduled for trial this summer. Defendants include retired Air Force Major General Richard Secord, retired Army General John Singlaub, and Iranian-born businessman Albert Hakim. This is dated May 1988. And the links with the Nicaraguan rebels. Well, serendipitously, Danny had stumbled on something that was real. And it goes back to the same group being involved with the bombing of Pan Am 103. Danny Casolaro had telephoned Lester Coleman and was uncovering the evidence that he had, not just on PROMIS that supported Michael Riconosciuto, but also the secret team's involvement in drugs and the bombing of Pan Am 103. Lester Coleman had released a book years later, The Trail of the Octopus, from Beirut to Lockerbie inside the DIA, because he worked for Defense Intelligence Agency, not CIA, but DIA, as an undercover. And he claimed that a secret drug sting enabled terrorists to evade airport security in the 1988 terrorist bombing of Pan Am Flight 103. Coleman claimed he was at one point employed by United States DEA. Coleman further alleged that a compromised American covert drug operation allowed Iranian-backed terrorists, the PFLP-GC, led by Ahmed Jibril, to slip a Semtex bomb aboard the plane. And on September 11, 1997, Coleman stated to the New York Federal Court that he lied when he claimed that a secret drug sting enabled terrorists to evade airport security and bombing. In a plea agreement, Coleman was sentenced to time served, which was just 5 months, and 6 months home confinement under electronic monitoring. However, conspiracies do allege that federal convictions of Lester Coleman were an effort to silence him and to hide the truth about Pan Am 103 started circulating. Well, his book confirms independent evidence and verification that I am going to reveal is substantiated, given the threats made against to destroy him and his wife and his family and force him to flee. So here's the key evidence in his book, which supports Danny Casolaro. He says he had been sent out by Overseas Press Services Inc., OPS, a television consultancy company run by W. Dennis Soot, formerly a CIA operative in Central America, an associate of Oliver North and General Singlaub, Contra leaders Adolfo and Mario Calero, and William Casey. Soot specialised in organising field trips for journalists to US-supported military and paramilitary operations around the world, notably in Afghanistan, Angola, Central America and Middle East. As consultants to Pat Robertson's television operations. Now, can you please hear me when I say this? Pat Robertson and his Christian broadcasting network were using OPS. Clearly felt that Frank's ability to distinguish one end of the camera from another was offset by the expertise he had acquired in counter-terrorist techniques at Psionics, a mysterious funded training school near Atlanta run by another North associate, retired Lieutenant General Mitchell Verbal. And it says here that during Lester Coleman had many discussions as he's working with them in Beirut, that Franks felt free to talk openly about OPS and the Contras. His boss, W. Dennis Soot, while undercover for CIA in Nicaragua as an ABC TV camera, had apparently been caught handing out bugged Zippo lighters to the Sandinistas, and ABC had fired him. And when not regaling Coleman with gossip of this sort, Frank spent most of his time fighting along the so-called Green Line with the Christian militias. So we have Lester Coleman across in Lebanon in the early 80s and exposing the link of Overseas Press Services Inc. with CIA, Oliver North, General Singlaub, involved with the Iran-Contras back then, but also working directly with Pat Robertson's television, Christian Broadcasting Network in Lebanon. Now, this part's very important. It turns out that Lester Coleman was asked to meet with the director of DIA and told that he had to apply for an ad in a paper that was going to appear the following week for employment with Pat Robertson's Christian Broadcasting Network to be posted to Lebanon. He confirms that it related to Operation Steeplechase and confirms that DIA had been monitoring activities at Virginia Beach headquarters of the Christian Broadcasting Network, which suggested that Pat Robertson's organisation was heavily engaged in raising money and providing support for the Nicaraguan Contras through Major General John K. Singlaub, president of the Taiwan-directed World Anti-Communist League, and Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, with the covert assistance of DCI William Casey and CIA James Whelan, a close friend of Casey's, had been installed at Pat Robertson's Christian Broadcasting Network to tap its database for fundraising, and it was a measure of the importance attached to Robertson's contribution that in 1985 the Contras named a brigade in his honour. He also goes on to identify other parties: Tony Werner as ASMA, the DIA agent in place, a Lebanese-German extraction. ASMA owned AMA Industries Cell, provided hospital supply business, which give access to every part of the country, every section of Beirut, regardless of what faction, Christian or Muslim, controlled it. Until Coleman arrived on the 25th of February 1985, the main duties of ASMA Cell had been to monitor the Muslim radical groups supported by Iran and Syria. So we have now independent verification that the Overseas Press Service Group that was exposed to have a ton of C4 explosives in a warehouse in Atlanta, what linked to Oliver North and John Singlaub and Richard Secord, is the same group that's over in Lebanon and working with Pat Robertson's Christian Broadcasting Network that's employed Lester Coleman. He's identified the same W. Dennis suit and confirmed their links with Nicaragua and Iran-Contra. Now, I found this article that supports that. It was called Holy Spirit or Holy Spook. And it's questioning sometimes religion and covert action, like religion and politics, get mixed together. Televangelist Pat Robertson, head of the Christian Broadcasting Network, CBN, has gone so far as to liken the presence of CIA agents to divine protection. A religious leader who can confuse God with CIA is capable of almost anything. Robertson's CBN funneled aid to Efrain Rios Montejanta in Guatemala and to the Contra armies in Honduras and Costa Rica. Robertson told the New York Times that CBN would send missionaries and more than $1 billion to Guatemala. The promise wasn't fully met, but the Guatemalan dictator used the pledges of support from the US evangelicals to convince Congress that he would not seek massive sums from the US government aid. So the State Department briefed Christian right leaders on the need for private support. And so you now have CBN now supplies chaplains and Bibles to the Contras. Lester Coleman was an American who was co-author of Trail of the Octopus. He was exposing that there was overwhelming evidence that the secret team were responsible for the bombing of Pan Am 103 to shut down McKee's investigation, and evidence being returned to the US. I will prove with the following independent evidence through my research that Lester Coleman was telling the truth, and he was forced to back down and flee overseas, given that the secret team and their dirty tricks were going to set him up and destroy him, that he couldn't beat them. So let's have a look at what he confirms. It says here, in return, DIA would pay him $5,000 a month plus expenses, but in a way that could not be traced directly back to the agency. He met with the director of DIA. You'll find in my slides and in his book the details of the meeting, and he's told to apply. He also received training, Defence Human Resource Intelligence program, and he became part of the unit which was called MC-10. And this is very important because Michael Riconosciuto was working with MC-10 together with the team for the recovery of the hostages, and he has confirmed independently the matters that are raised by Lester Coleman, particularly in Nicosia, Cyprus. And he actually received clearance beyond top secret. MC-10 reported to Special Technical Operations Center, the Pentagon. And then he's got here, what about Thomas Levy? I've still got that birth certificate. He had, if you read his book, he had previously been used by CIA as an asset to go to Bahamas to recover confidential documents that were proving embarrassment, given the death of a particular person had in their possession. The widower was going to provide that evidence back. So they sent him on a mission to Bahamas, and so he was aware of who the secret team was. He also talks about the fact that he was also getting expertise relating to INSCOM, Army Intelligence, and other operations before he was sent to Lebanon. He was told to look out for a help wanted ad in the broadcasting magazine placed by Christian Broadcasting Network, operated by Pat Robertson. CBN, he was told that CBN would be looking to hire a Middle East correspondent, and when the ad appeared, Coleman should apply for the job. He confirms, just before Christmas, right after the holidays, Coleman flew down to be interviewed. CBN's Virginia Beach headquarters, and he was interviewed by a guy with a British accent who worked for MI6 under the code name Romeo. Was at the time general manager of CBN's Middle East television division based in Jerusalem, and had flown over to hire correspondents for his bureau in Beirut. And he goes through summarising, they all think they've been called by Jesus to work for Pat Robertson. It's the sort of feeling that he's getting, that people are coming forward wanting to work for his missions overseas. He says that Romeo introduced him to Pat Robertson's son Tim. Now this part's very important. He's meeting with Pat Robertson and his son, and the three of them went off to meet the great man himself at a local restaurant where they prayed over the salad bar. During lunch, Robertson's explained that their Middle Eastern division, television network, operated from studios in Jerusalem with a transmitter in Israel, occupied South Lebanon, an office in Nicosia, Cyprus, and a news bureau in the Christian enclave in Beirut, where he was going to be assigned. It was funny coalition, Coleman found. You had the right-wing Christian Americans, the Israelis, the right-wing Christian Lebanese fascists, funded, trained and uniformed by the Israeli army, all working together and in bed with outfits like Pat Robertson's Christian Broadcasting Network. And he says, over dessert, Pat Robertson explained at some length that his interest in the region stemmed from his belief that the second coming of Jesus Christ was imminent in the Holy Land, and he intended to cover it live. So you can see the thinking here and motivation. And as far as its audience was aware, the whole operation was funded entirely by the American faithful, of which most generous, as Coleman discovered later, was faithful Bill Casey, director of CIA, and his friends from the Jewish Defense League. So this is his information and evidence, independent of Danny Casolaro and independent of other investigations, but let's see where this goes. Coleman's job was to find file stories from Met's Lebanon Bureau, new national news programs that Robertsons were planning to set up in the United States. They always had some major project going, he remembers. Pat would say he had been talking to Jesus, and Jesus had told him he wanted him to do this or do that, so CBM would then go out and hire the people they needed. Key part here, he says a guy by the name of Don Levy had already told him to set January aside for his crash course in DIA human intelligence operations. CIA agents, graduates in classes of 40 from spy school at Camp Perry, Virginia, not far from Williamsburg. And as a DIA human intelligence agent, Coleman was trained alone, one-on-one, having little contact with anybody but his instructors and no contact with anyone outside his chain of command. So this is all happening in 1985, which is the key time that I believe all our evidence is coming together for Iran-Contra, the first channel of funds involving the secret team. I've covered this before, but he mentions Operation Steeplechase. They'd infiltrated. It was linked with OPS, with Nicaraguan Contra deals with Xinglaub, World Anti-Communism League, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, DCCI William Casey, and a CIA James Whelan, close friend of Casey, who'd been installed at the Christian Broadcasting Network to tap its databases and for fundraising. Okay, so let's move forward a little bit more. And now we get to the interesting part. He confirms in particular of those was Sheikh Mohammed Hussein Fadlallah, and to keep track of Western hostages being taken in Beirut. After Coleman's arrival, Samar's control and his communications linked with DIA headquarters, this were continued, but with the added responsibility of trailing Oliver North and his boss Robert McFarlane, President Reagan's national security advisor, as when the Iranian Contra conspiracy brought them to the region to buy illegal arms. So we're now at the point where Lester Coleman is there with the secret team under the guise of Pat Robertson's Christian Broadcasting Network, and they're now getting ready to make the purchase of the arms required for the release of hostages that's been negotiated by Ted Shackley with Gorbanafar, involving the finance of the BCCI checks involving the Kuwait royal family. With Robert Sensi working for Robert Gray, William Casey, Clint Murchison, you have all the ingredients coming together for the focus of Danny Casolaro's smoking gun evidence. He also says that there was an operation called Doc Lamp, Defence Attaché System, and involved the 7th Brigade Special Forces detachments in Lebanon. He also says that all these activities, Robertson's Middle East television had close ties with Lebanon's right-wing Christian groups, which were largely funded by drugs trafficking, and in particular with the Christian Lebanese forces, a militia largely funded by Israel. He said he also quickly discovered the main function of Pat Robertson's Christian Broadcasting Network Links was to enable Antonine to contact Odette in Tel Aviv via Zurich on behalf of Mossad. So there you go. DIA's concern about Iran-Contra conspirators was focused in particular on Oliver North's Georgia mafia. And this part's now getting back to the evidence exposed with OPS by Daniel Sheehan. And he says whose representative, Michael Franks, was also known as Michael Schaefer, arrived in Beirut soon after Coleman. He says that Frank stepped off the boat from Cyprus wearing full army battle fatigues with a mercenary patch on his black military baseball cap. He had been sent out by Overseas Press Services Inc., a television consultancy company run by W. Dennis Soot, formerly CIA operative in Central America, an associate of Oliver North, Singh-Loud Contra leaders, and William Casey. Soot specialised in organising field trips for journalists to US-supported military and paramilitary operations around the world, notably in Afghanistan, Angola, Central America and Middle East. I believe we now have independent evidence that the same group that Danny Sheehan has exposed has a ton of C4 explosives is the secret team. And here they are, involved in the rescue of the hostages in Lebanon, and at the same time are running their sanctioned illegal drugs and arms network with Oliver North. So, I won't go over all this again. I'm just going to reconfirm to you. But it does say, he does clearly identify, the purpose of the meeting was to discuss consignment of arms confiscated by Israelis from the PLO. So, it turns out that Operation Steeplechase, 22nd of April 1985, he says Coleman and office manager Gashen Hashim flew to Cairns to join Tim Robertson. Now look at this. This part's important. Tim Robertson, the son of Pat Roy, is attending a meeting in a private apartment with Pierre Diella of the Christian Lebanese Forces Militia, Mario Calero, representing the Contras, and British agent from MI6 working undercover with DIA. So here is your Iran-Contra deal being made in April 1985 involving Pat Robertson's Christian Broadcasting Network as the negotiation or the negotiator. The purpose of the meeting was to discuss consignment of arms confiscated by the Israelis from the PLO over to the pro-Israeli faction of the Lebanese forces. The idea was to buy them secretly for the Contras and send them out to Honduras disguised as relief supplies on a ship chartered by Christian Broadcasting Network. But the problem was that the Hubaka faction had declined a cash offer, preferring to exchange the weapons for an unspecified commodity to the value of $1.5 million to be brokered by a CIA asset, Monza Al-Qassar. And that name is all over Danny's notes, Danny Casolaro's notes. After an animated discussion, Hubaka's terms were accepted in principle and the meeting adjourned, and the Christian Broadcasting Network contingent contingent to advise Oliver North with a view to setting the wheels in motion, and Coleman to advise DIA with a view to applying the brakes. Control responded by calling him to Frankfurt. So Lester Coleman's been called back. On the strength of his report, the DIA decided to scrap the whole vehicle. This Christian Broadcasting Network thing is getting to be a real pain in the ass, Don Levy said. So this is now the critical part. Early in June, Alcázar flew out to Bogota, Colombia on a Brazilian passport. He gives the number of the passport in the name of Musagi, one of several aliases. By prior arrangement, 1.5 million had been transferred from Oliver North's secret contrafund at the BCCI in Panama to Alcázar's own BCCI account in Lima, Peru, which he held under the name of Pierre Abu Nada. From there, the money was credited to a BCI account managed for one of the Colombian cocaine cartels by Frank Gerardo, a DEA informant for the purposes of several hundred kilos of cocoa base. If this be true, then we have the Christian Broadcasting Network as a vehicle, a willing vehicle, for the payments of the sales of cocaine facilitated through their network with Oliver North's secret team and Ted Shackley. And so this is where it gets very interesting. It turns out that a mission to North, who was then in Cyprus, staying in the ambassador's private apartment at the US Embassy in Nicosia. Coleman observed him there on the 15th of June. Now, Michael Riconosciuto has given testimony that he was based and working in Nicosia, Cyprus, and staying at the apartment owned by Robert Boot Nichols and his wife Alan Hopko Nichols, as they were running Euromay Trading Corporation as a listening post on the hostages. And now we've got drugs involving Monza Alcázar and agents in Sofia, Bulgaria, and going through Warsaw and the Eastern Bloc and of course originating from Lebanon. And it says on the 23rd of August, Coleman reported to control the arms were being loaded within 10 days, same freighter, and was now waiting to sail to Puerto Lampura, Honduras. So we are now closing the transaction under the banner of the Christian Broadcasting Network Central American Relief Program known as Operation Blessing. You can read his book, pages and detail. But the overwhelming evidence is, if this is a lie, it's a big lie. But if it's true, can I validate that this is really something that was taking place? And so he goes through and confirms the role of OPS mercenary group with Michael Franks, alias Schaefer. He confirms the involvement of the American Embassy in Nicosia, Cyprus, and he even names the DEA agent that he's working with from Michael T. Hurley is involved in this operation. And as you will find that Michael T. Hurley is the person alleged by Michael Riconosciuto and also Lester Coleman had flown back to set Michael Riconosciuto up in a DEA drug sting to have him arrested, given he wasn't remaining silent about PROMIS and drugs and what he knew about the bombing of Pan Am 103. So let's have a look at all these pieces and see if we can work out. Lester Coleman has opened this world up here independently with John Singlaub. It involves Richard Viguerie. The Hunt brothers are financing these particular vehicles for raising funds for Iran-Contra. We've got WACL, we've got US Council for World Freedom, we've got CNP involving Pat Robertson, and we've got AmeriCare involving Peter Grace, a Knights of Malta frontier. Independently linked into these particular events involving the hostages, the Iran-Contra deal, the first channel being set up in 1985 by Ted Shackley, Gorbanafar, Adnan Khashoggi, financed by financed by the Kuwait royal family, Kuwait Airlines using Robert Sensi working for William Casey, and Robert Gray. So we've got William Casey, Robert Gray, Ted Shackley, and then also we've got evidence of George Pender running Fidco as the direct link with Robert Booth Nichols into Kuwait, in Lebanon, with the drug cartels of heroin and their links back to the Gambinos and with CIA, with Robert Mayhew and their friendship with Ted Shackley. So let's continue with this bit here. And we've covered overseas press services with Singlaub and a warehouse of C4 explosives and a group of mercenaries involved in the sensitive matter of drugs, illegal arms, and clearly Charlie McKee's team flying back with disturbing evidence that they're going to raise with their superiors of this secret team's involvement in sanctioned drugs and illegal arms was now jeopardising his efforts to rescue the hostages. In addition to his book, which he wrote many years later, when Michael Riconosciuto rang him and heard about, when Danny Casolaro rang Lester Coleman and told him about he's investigating PROMIS and the bombing of Pan Am 103, the secret team, it turns out that Lester Coleman gave an affidavit back to Bill Hamilton because he had witnessed Michael Riconosciuto in Nicosia, Cyprus, Michael T. Hurley, and also had witnessed the PROMIS software being delivered. So listen to this affidavit which he provided. He says that in November 1984, Defence Intelligence Agency offered me a position in human intelligence operations in the Middle East. I was raised in the Middle East where I lived in Iran, Libya and Saudi Arabia. I speak 3 dialects of Arabic and some Farsi. I accepted the position and received training from DIA. I was assigned to the Middle East Intelligence Unit. Between February and September 1987, I was seconded by DIA to the Drug Enforcement Administration DEA in Nicosia, Cyprus, reporting to DEA Country Attaché Michael T. Hurley. After a cover assignment in the United States, I was again seconded to DEA in Nicosia, Cyprus in early 1988. Again. During April and May 1988, I worked in the office of Euromay Trading Company Limited in Nicosia, Cyprus, a DEA proprietary company. On about May 29th, 1988, because of my concerns about poor security in the DEA operation in Cyprus, I returned to the United States, having previously obtained the concurrence of a DEA. During my stints as DIA Covert Intelligence Officer seconded to DEA in Nicosia, Cyprus, I became aware of the fact that DEA was using a proprietary company, Euromay Trading Company, to sell computer software called PROMIS, or PROMIS, to the drug abuse control agencies of various countries in the Middle East, including Cyprus, Pakistan, Syria, Kuwait, and Turkey. I personally witnessed the unpacking at the Nicosia, Cyprus Police Force Narcotics Squad of boxes containing reels of computer tapes and computer hardware. The boxes bore the name and a red logo of a Canadian corporation with the words PROMIS or PROMIS, and limited in the company name. The DEA objective in inducing the implementation of this computerized PROMIS system in the drug abuse control agencies of the Middle East countries was to augment the drug control resources available to the United States government by making it possible for the United States government to access sensitive drug control, law enforcement and intelligence files of these Middle East governments. It also my understanding that third-party funds were generally made available for the purchase of these computer software and hardware systems. One third-party funding source was the United Nations Fund for Drug Abuse Control in Vienna, Austria. As DEA country attaché for Cyprus, Michael T. Hurley had overall responsibility for both Euromay Trading Company Limited and its initiative to sell PROMIS software computer systems to the Middle East countries for drug abuse control. In 1990, DEA reassigned Hurley to DEA intelligence position in Washington State. I became aware in 1991 that Michael Riconosciuto, known to me as longtime CIA asset, was arrested in Washington State by DEA for manufacturing of illegal chemical drugs. I had also become aware of the fact that Riconosciuto had made a sworn statement prior to his arrest about his participation in a covert US intelligence initiative to sell Inslaw's PROMIS software to foreign governments. In light of Hurley's personal involvement in the US government's covert intelligence initiative to sell PROMIS software to foreign governments and his reassignment to DEA intelligence position in Washington State in advance of the DEA's arrest of Riconosciuto, the arrest of Riconosciuto should be regarded as suspect. I do not believe that Hurley's posting to a drug intelligence position in Washington State in advance of Riconosciuto's arrest on drug charges is merely coincidental. Rather, the probability is that Hurley was reassigned to Washington State to manufacture a case against Riconosciuto in order to prevent Riconosciuto from becoming a credible witness about the US government's covert sale of PROMIS software to foreign governments. The investigative journalist Danny CASOLARO contacted me in Europe on August the 3rd, 1991. That's 7 days before he's found dead. Mr. CASOLARO had leads and hard information about things that I know about, including Department of Justice groups operating overseas, the sale of PROMIS software by the US government to foreign governments, the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, BCCI, and the Iran-Contra scandal. I subsequently learned of Mr. CASOLARO's death in Martinsburg, West Virginia 1 week later on August 10th, 1991. I contacted Inslaw in October 1991 after learning about Mr. CASOLARO's death under suspicious circumstances. That is amazing and independent verification of Danny's research, but more important, Michael's testimony and ongoing willingness to testify further. Alan James Frankovic, an American filmmaker, made the Maltese double cross to expose the CIA cover-up of their illegal drug operations and arms deals that was jeopardizing the rescue of the hostages by the McKee team, and that the McKee team and the deputy chief of CIA from Lebanon were all returning on the same flight, Pan Am 103, with their evidence to report back to their superiors that was of great threat to Ted Shackley's and Oliver North and Richard Secord's, their secret team. That was the motive for the bombing of 103, involving the secret team within networks with Wackenhut. And the evidence linking to Ishmael Babouti's company in Malta and the transfer of that luggage from Malta onto the Frankfurt arm was a part of a cover-up in the investigation that links the secret team to the bombing. This part is now critical. After the death, let's go back, the mysterious death of Alan James Frankovic, who was racing across the US to meet with Michael Riconosciuto with the new evidence linking the bombing to the secret team and Ed Wilson's C4 explosives. And the sudden heart attack in the customs area when he arrives at the George Bush Intercontinental Airport in Houston in 1997. Lester Coleman, with the family on behalf of the producer of the Double Maltese Cross, filed a lawsuit against Vincent Canestraro, Theodore Shackley, after given his death against his estate, Lieutenant General Richard Secord, various CIA agents and FBI agents, and the Assistant Director of FBI, Oliver Buck Revell. And in his lawsuit, he confirms the cover-up included their secret program called TD Wave, was established, disassembled, discredit, demonize, financially destroy and silence anyone, including the plaintiffs, who could possibly link the Central Intelligence Agency to the bomb that brought down Pan Am Flight 103. He confirms categorically agents of United States, their co-conspirators, clear motive to persecute, incarcerate and silence the plaintiffs and others was finally exposed. Retired CIA officer Edwin P. Wilson claimed from his solitary prison cell that he'd been working for CIA when his company, International Consultants, shipped 20 tons of plastic explosives from Houston, Texas, and trained the Gaddafi regime to blow up things like airliners. Wilson's partners in International Consultants were the CIA Director of Counterintelligence Theodore Shackley and retired Air Force General Richard Secord, both named as defendants in this litigation. He also confirms that he has extensive background in the Middle East. He's a journalist, author with numerous awards, international Edward R. Murrow Award, appeared on NBC Nightly News and also The Night After the Bombing, linking CIA renegade Ed Wilson to the plot. He then appeared in the film The Maltese Double Cross. A year later, after the book about him, the trailer was published in paper book, Coleman was an agent with the US Defense Intelligence Agencies involved in classified activities, and after his revelations, Pan Am bombing, while suffering from cancer, he was brutalized and abused, interrogated using noise and flashing light therapy, moved from country 16 times while illegally held for 154 days in federal custody. If you go on and have a look, he also now is going to reveal some interesting information that no one else would ever know, but I'm going to reveal. He confirms that he's acting on a complaint from the defendant's Central Bank and Trust of Kentucky in a blatant effort to silence, demonize, and ultimately destroy him in concert with co-offenders named herein. Listen to this. His charges were concocted by CIA and TD Wave operative James P. Vassilos. Now that name means nothing to anyone else. He says that James P. Vassilos placed checks drawn on an overseas bank into Coleman's bank accounts and then clear them on deposits. Vassilos is previously listed as one of the unknown Central Intelligence agents and offended in this action. CBT has a long history of involvement with CIA defendants, further detailed later in the complaint. Now what's important here is no one knows that name. Jimmy Rothstein confirms categorically James P. Vassilos was acting as Michael Riconosciuto's attorney when he was first arrested. He rang Jimmy Rothstein and arranged for Jimmy Rothstein to meet with Michael Riconosciuto in prison to assist him. And then James Vassilos disappears, telling Jimmy Rothstein that he's fearful for his life, they're going to kill me. And it turns out that James Vassilos is the trusted attorney from CIA to help any CIA asset that gets caught. If they're Air America and shipping drugs, he's called in to represent them. In this case, he's called in to assist Michael Riconosciuto, and then when Michael Riconosciuto is blowing the whistle about what he knows, he can't represent him anymore and completely disappears. So that's why he's in this particular case, but what's not known is that that was Michael Riconosciuto's first attorney, and he's a CIA attorney. I also will do a podcast that he's involved with banker Ambrosiana and other banks with William Colby and the Archbishop Paul Masinkas. So he's intimately involved in the expertise of money laundering, and he used to be married to the founder of ABN, the daughter. And so he is an expert on money laundering. In addition, he says that Coleman were named as potential witnesses in the trial of two Libyans in Holland. And they were arrested and detained and prevented them from appearing at a trial to give testimony. Solicitors representing one of the accused, Khalid Fahima, came to the United States and interviewed the plaintiff Coleman while he was held in custody over objections of federal authorities. Fahima was found innocent of all charges against him. This is the important part, is that his lawsuit, following the death of the producer who covered the double Maltese cross, suspiciously having a heart attack in customs when arriving to continue his investigations into the evidence exposing the CIA secret team were behind the bombing of Pan Am 103, he continued his efforts on behalf of the producer. He confirms Alan Franskovic dropped dead at the hand of TD Wave while attempting to clear US customs in 1997. He confirms that he was exposing the US intelligence cover-up, the evidence of it, and the circumstances leading to Pan Am 103 disaster. His research depicted how the bomb was actually placed aboard the Pan Am flight, the CIA role as provider of expertise in building a bomb inside a Toshiba radio. And on company business which documented CIA's overthrow of Salvador Allende government in Chile, placing it with the ruthless Augusto Pinochet regime, now exposed as a world-class mass murderer. So he's going to expose these. He says here, this is the part that's very important. The defendant, Theodore SHACKLEY, died at his home in Bathsheba on December 12, 2002. SHACKLEY rose to be Assistant Director of Counterintelligence at the CIA until he was forced out in the agency shake-up by incoming Director of Central Intelligence Stanford Turner. SHACKLEY pretended to retire in 1979, a classic feint by clandestine operatives and counterinsurgency specialists. In actual fact, SHACKLEY went about creating a network using his principal protege, Vincent Canestraro, who became head of the CIA Counter-Terrorism Center. His longtime partner across the Potomac, FBI Director Counterintelligence Oliver Buck Revelle, and defendant General Richard Secord. After SHACKLEY's official departure from CIA in 1979, Canestraro rose to take his mentor's position as Director of Counterintelligence. In true SHACKLEY tradition, Canestraro also pretended to retire from the CIA in 1989, after a year after the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103. TD Wave officially went off the books with his departure. Now, this is a lawsuit that I haven't seen reported anywhere, but this part is the gold. Abu Nidal recently died in Baghdad before the US invasion. He left behind copious journals filled with vibrant accounts of his activities as a CIA asset, including a company called Zibado, Zibado, and involvement of SHACKLEY, Canestraro, Revelle, and Richard Secord. Zibado was the principal conduit to move millions that was used by TD Wave to train Libyan hit squads and others, including Ahmed Jibril and his PFLP-GC based in Damascus, Syria. The Nidal, Libyan, and Jibril connection with TD Wave is personally known by CIA operative Dr. Richard Fuse, who was a NOC, non-official cover, based in Damascus during the years prior to the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103. Dr. Fuse will also testify to these assertions. The training and arming of terror cells was classic SHACKLEY to effectively counter terrorists by covertly coddling them. This is incredible link with Abu Nidal. Now remember, 2 weeks before Danny Casolaro is found dead, the auditors of BCCI in England exposed that they have evidence of $60 million being transferred by the Kuwait embassy to the BCCI accounts owned by Abu Nidal. After bombing of Pan Am 103, TD Wave moved to keep the lid on Wilson's sanctioned relationships with Libya and the CIA's contacts with Abu Nidal and Jibril to train them on building bombs inside boombox radios. After assuring the silence of Alan Francevic by his death when arriving in Houston on flight from London, TD Wave moved on to silence two characters in Francevic's film, The Maltese Double Cross. TD Wave was actually reactivated the day after the bombing of Pan Am Clipper. Made of the seas, its sole mission was to bury the connection between CIA, namely Shackley's numerous enterprises, and the Libyan regime of Gaddafi. The TD Wave enterprise was spawned from Shackley's earlier covert operations at the CIA station in Miami that dated back to the early 60s. TD Wave had established a CIA proprietary company behind the Iron Curtain identified as Zarbado. 36 Friedrichstrasse, Berlin, German Democratic Republic, East Berlin. The principal proprietor of Zarbado was well-known Middle East terrorist Abu Nidal. 6 months later, the other key figure in Francevich's film, former Defense Intelligence Agent Lester Coleman, was arrested in a hotel 8,000 miles away in Lexington, Kentucky, July 1999. Local police swooped down on him, accompanied by federal agents, and charged him with possessing forged documents, mainly foreign bank checks that appeared in his account at Central Bank and Trust of Kentucky, cleared on deposit. His arrest was the work of TD Wave operative James P. Vasilos, with the cooperation of the bank. Now this part's very important. It keeps coming back. No one knows that James P. Vasilos was Michael Riconosciuto's original attorney, and he abandoned him after contacting Jimmy Rothstein to help him, fearing for his life, saying that he would be killed and he's going into hiding. So that's overwhelming evidence that even he was now fearing his life. It says here the ruthless campaign would have worked if not Ed Wilson's dogged effort to free himself, for taking the fall for the CIA's covert arming and training of Libyans and others. On October 27, 2003, Judge Hughes declared that Wilson was working for CIA and the CIA had lied to the court under oath. The CIA lied had kept one of their own in prison for 22 years. The Wilson decision made Shackley's catchphrase plausible deniability no longer plausible and no longer deniable. Evidence shows Canestraro and Revel had postings in the US Embassy Rome. On the posh Via Veneto, Wilson's operation to supply and train Libyan hit squads run out of CIA's Rome station. And of course that's where Dwayne Claridge was positioned as well. The Rome station also ran a covert operation to ship military supplies to Iraq in the early 80s. Kinex was a CIA proprietary listed as Kabara International Exports, owned by two Lebanese brothers, Zawa and Nabim Kabara. In actual fact, it was a cover for TD Wave. Telephone number of Kinex rang inside the US Embassy, who paid the bill. This is an amazing evidence that's been found independently. Plaintiffs were not only the former US intelligence operatives to become targets of TD Wave. Arms dealer Sarkis Sognalian, a CIA agent in place in Iraq, was playing Saddam Hussein like a fiddle. Suddenly Sarkis was indicted, Shackley's old Miami backyard, on a single weapons charge for illegally owning one RPG. Sarkis knew the truth and shall now so testify. Defendant FBI agent David Edward was a pawn in the TD Wave plot on the short leash of Oliver Buck Revell. Edward was the street agent who went after the plaintiff Coleman and Pan Am investigator Juval Avid to shut down their claims linking the CIA to Pan Am bombing. Aviv had to spend his savings to defend federal trumped-up mail fraud charges. A jury acquitted him in Southern District of New York in 1996. TD Wave FBI fabrications included 1992 attempt to deport Coleman from his sanctuary in Sweden. Swedish secret police, SAPO, determined the deportation request was ranked with FBI lies. The Coleman family remained guests of the Swedish government. So it goes on and confirms further links of TD Wave and the dirty tricks of the secret team to destroy any credible witness that has credible evidence that will expose their link to the bombing of Pan Am 103. And so we now have quite a bit of evidence independently coming through, linking back to the secret team and the motive, linking the same group involved with the Iran-Contra, first channel, arms for release of the hostages, involving Ted Shackley, Gorbanafar, Michael Ledeen, and then going through to the secret team, which is also involved on the ground, close to the rescue attempts, genuine rescue attempts of the McKee team, together with Lester Coleman, together with Michael Riconosciuto, and then of course the evidence was found that would destroy them by the McKee team, which meant that they would allow for the bomb on Pan Am 103 to bring down the evidence that would destroy them. So looking at the big picture, based on the evidence from independent sources of Danny Casolaro, Michael Riconosciuto, Lester Coleman, plus the wonderful in-depth research and legal evidence that was building up by Daniel Sheehan and the Christic Institute, let me go one step further to show how this really happens. The real part is, what evidence is there that Lester Coleman has provided, claiming that he was employed by the Christian broadcasting network owned by Pat Robertson and Tim Robertson, was being used as a front by Oliver North, John Singlaub, Ted Shackley and Oliver North to allow for drugs to come into Australia, and the sale of those drugs was financing the purchase of the arms captured by the Israelis from the PLO that could be provided to the Iran-Contra rebels. The article Holy Spirit or Holy Spook begins to raise questions about Pat Robertson, Tim Robertson's Christian Broadcast Network, being used to prop up dictators with CIA and dirty tricks in countries of including Israel, Argentina, South Africa, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and using and partnership with CIA. It says counterinsurgency is a dirty business involving a lot of killing. The killers need assurances that they are pursuing godly crusade to continue the work with a good conscience. What better than to use churches, missionaries, foundations as a front? It talks about the fact that Pat Robertson was also considering the presidential running against Bush and make his bid. And of course, he founded the Council for Freedom as a way of raising funds for his presidential election. And the Freedom Council filed as many delegate candidates as Vice President George Bush, had Robertson trailing behind Bush. as it got closer to the election. So his links with the Christian right, a far right, is loved by Oliver North, John Signal, The Secret Team, Ted Shackley. This is a press release or a news interview with Pat Robertson. And he states on July 11th in 1987 that Robertson was considering a run for the Republican presidential nomination, and he said he and North just happened to bump into each other at a Washington airport. He just happened to say, Robertson said, "I'm going to Iran to meet some of the leadership to try to negotiate the release of some of our hostages." This is what North says to Pat Robertson. Robertson said North asks, "Would you please pray for me?" And of course, Oliver North denies that he's doing this. Now, I'm going to show you overwhelming evidence that what Lester Coleman has put in his book about Pat Robertson's Christian Broadcasting Network with its links with the secret team is true. This is dated 1992, April, a few months after Danny is found dead, or in fact it's a year after, 9 months later. TV evangelist Pat Robertson, chairman of Christian Broadcasting Network, and his son Timothy, who met with the Iran-Contra rebels with the secret team to negotiate the Iran-Contra deal, will turn $183,000 investment into stock worth $96 million when a cable television programming company they control sells shares to go public this month. Now this doesn't seem to mean much to anyone, but it means a lot. The Robertsons controlled company called International Family Entertainment Inc. operates the Family Channel, which is acquired from CBN 2 years ago. CBN received security valued at $250 million. Just repeat that. CBN received securities valued at $250 million for the Family Channel, which provides programming to cable operators. It says after unsuccessful discussions with a number of potential buyers, CBN entered into talks with, here it comes, Telecommunications Inc., known as TCI, the largest cable system operator. In November 1989, the Robertsons incorporated a company called International Family Entertainment with TCI as a minority investor. The Robertsons invested $150,000 in exchange for controlling interest in the new company, buying 4.5 million shares for 3.3 cents a share. These are big numbers. 250 million securities have been received for floating a new company with TCI. And I want you to remember Telecommunications Inc., TCI. And why am I putting this on the screen? To support independently the evidence of Lester Coleman. And this is why. This is the official BCCI reports. I'm highlighting the parts that relate to our secret team, and you'll see the evidence is overwhelming. It talks about the links of BCCI with CIA and foreign intelligence, the role that Clark Clifford and Robert Altman played. It highlights the role that Hill and Knowlton and BCCI PR campaign did, the role of Ed Rogers with Gamal Adam the founder of BCCI, former Saudi intelligence. It also highlighted, and I want you to remember this, it won't be in this podcast, but Kissinger Associates was in the stages of acquiring BCCI before the investigation kicked off. Kissinger Associates was behind CIA's safe SWIFT banking software sold to the Club of Rome banks, which I've revealed is the fusion of all intelligence databases. Next, Capcom, and this is the one I'm going to focus on. Capcom, it's a company, a case study of money laundering. So what does that have to do with Pat Robertson's company? And here it goes. The summary of the report was about money laundering. BCCI's indictments on drug money laundering charges in Tampa, Florida in October 1988. There was little doubt to anyone looking at the facts that BCCI had been used to launder drug money. Customs agents working on Operation Sea Chase case against BCCI moved millions of dollars in US currency representing proceeds of cocaine sales through BCCI Panama, BCCI Luxembourg and Loans Switzerland as a result of the knowing participation of several BCCI officials which were arrested. As customs agent Robert Mazur, who selected BCI as the target of a customs money laundering sting, testified, BCCI bank executives volunteered methods to enhance and improve his technique for money laundering, showing before the sting ended the operation offered to introduce Mazur to other potential cash customers for money laundering services from Bogota, Colombia. Keep that in mind. I think that came up before. Attorneys for BCCI and the bank itself contended that the Tampa case represented an accident involving a small number of bank officers. Indeed, when BCCI itself pled guilty to money laundering in January 1990, the bank continued to take the position that this guilty plea only constituted an admission that a few of its employees had engaged in activity and that its guilty plea was based solely on the theory of corporate responsibility, respondent superior. As BCCI attorneys argued to the federal prosecutors, the Senate staff prior to the bank's January 1990 plea agreement, it was inevitable that the bank operating in so many countries would be used for drug traffickers. This was particularly true as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State of International Narcotics Matters acknowledged. Isn't that wonderful? So why is this important? Because BCCI began in February 1988, in early second year, the investigation, you're going to like this, they were investigating the relationship between drug trafficking to US foreign policy and law enforcement had been authorised by the full committee during a hearing on General Noriega's drug trafficking and money laundering. BCCI was identified as facilitating Noriega's criminal activity. In March 1988, the Foreign Relations Committee authorised the issuance of subpoenas to BCCI and those at the bank involved in handling Noriega's assets and the accounts of others in Panama and Colombia. Service of those subpoenas was delayed at the request of the Justice Department and US Customs Services due to concern that its service could interfere with an ongoing sting operation of BCCI in Tampa, Operation Sea Chase. By the time the subcommittee secured the permission of the federal authorities to move forward with the service of the subpoena in late July 1988, the subcommittee had completed the public hearings in connection with the investigative mandate and was proceeding to complete its final report with no further investigative efforts planned. This is in the report. And now the gold. BCCI's commodity affiliate Capcom engaged in billions of dollars of largely anonymous trading in the US, which included a very substantial level of money laundering, while Capcom simultaneously developed significant ties to important US, here it comes, in telecommunications industry executives and foreign intelligence figures. It turns out that BCC Commodities affiliate Capcom was based in Chicago, London and Cairo, and was principally staffed by former BCCI bankers, capitalised by BCCI and BCCI customers, and owned by BCCI shareholders and frontmen. So this is the real thing. Capcom employed many of the same practices as BCCI, especially the use of nominees and front companies to disguise ownership and movement of money. 4 US citizens, none of whom had any experience or expertise in commodities market, played important varied roles as Capcom frontmen in the United States. And while investigation information concerning Capcom is incomplete, its activities appear to have included misappropriation of BCCI assets, the laundering of billions of dollars from the Middle East to the US and other parts of the world, and siphoning of assets from BCCI to create a safe haven for them outside the BCCI empire. And now, here we go. Who owned Capcom? And how does it relate to Pat Robertson's Christian Broadcasting Network? Capcom's majority shareholders were Kamal Adam and A.R. Kahil, were both former senior Saudi government officials and successively acted as Saudi Arabia's principal liaisons to the Central Intelligence Agency during 1970s and 80s. They're the key people dealing with Ted Shackley, William Colby, Richard Helms, William Casey, George Bush Sr. Its US frontmen included, but this is the part that I want you to have a look at, Robert Magnus, CEO of the largest US cable telecommunications company, TCI, and Vice President of TCI, Larry Rumrell, and 2 other Americans, Kerry Fox, Robert Powell, with long-standing business interests in the Middle East. Magnus, Rumrell, and Fox received loans from BCCI for real estate ventures in the US. Magnus and Rumrell discussed numerous business ventures between BCCI and TCI, some of which involved possible purchases of US telecommunications stock and substantial lending by BCI. So we now have a direct link to Pat Robertson's float. Now this report is released in 92, and let's go back to the press release, April 92, and Pat Robertson has just secured 250 million securities with TCI, the same company involved in the money laundering of Noriega's drugs, arms, with the secret team with CIA. And so you really have commodities regulators, and this is the part you'll like, with the responsibility for investigating Capcom, showed little interest in conducting a thorough investigation of its activities. And in 1989, they allowed Capcom to avoid such an investigation through agreeing to cease doing business in the United States. It was the massive stock fraud on the Chicago Stock Exchange. Do you like that? Again, I'll just say that. The company and the directors, in a partnership with Pat Robertson's company, laundering funds worth billions of dollars of BCCI through the stock market, Chicago stock market, when you read the report, were never investigated and just allowed to stop doing business in the USA. And so the question asked in the report is, the relationship between Capcom and BCCI, between Capcom and the intelligence community, and between Capcom's shareholders and the US telecommunications industry figures, TCI. The subcommittee was able to interview people and review documents concerning Capcom that no other investigators had to date interviewed or reviewed. They conclude much more needs to be done to understand what Capcom was doing in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in Egypt, in Oman and the Middle East, in concluding whether the firm, as has been alleged but not proven, used by intelligence community to move funds for intelligence operations, and whether any person involved with Capcom was seeking secretly to acquire interest in the US telecommunications industry. That independently substantiates the cover-up of the intelligence links with Pat Robertson's Christian Network, Oliver North and the Secret Turn for funding the Iran-Contra, but also the links with the drugs from the cartels for cocaine and heroin, and payments for the guns being purchased from Israel that were captured from the PLO, and the transfers of funds by BCCI, the Kuwait embassies, and relationships of Ted Shackley and his secret team with the international terrorist Abu Nidal. There are overwhelming evidences of why Danny Casolaro was murdered. He had the smoking gun, he had the signed checks. So this is independently verifying Lester Coleman's testimony, affidavit, witness accounts, double Maltese cross, and the final BCCI report, which never really investigated or prosecuted, given that CIA was preventing and refusing to admit that they had accounts and links with BCCI, with the secret team, with BCCI. This is the part that was really a summary of the other octopus, Robert Gray, Gray & Co. Company, and then Hill and Knowlton. The report states quite candidly, BCCI's public relation firm smeared people who were telling the truth as part of its work for BCCI. When Hill and Knowlton accepted BCCI accounts in October 1980, its partner knew BCCI's reputation as a sleazy bank, but took the account anyway. In 1988 and 89, Hill and Knowlton assisted BCI with aggressive public relations campaign designed to demonstrate that BCCI was not a criminal enterprise and to put the best face possible on the Tampa drug money laundering indictments. In so doing, it disseminated materials unjustifiably and unfairly discrediting persons and publications who were telling the truth about BCCI's criminality. Important information provided by Hill and Knowlton to Capitol Hill and provided the First American regulators concerning the relationship between BCCI and First American in April 1990 was false. The misleading material represented the position of BCCI, First American, Clifford and Altman concerning the relationship and was contrary to the truth known by BCCI, Clifford and Altman. Hill and Knowlton represents BCCI was within the norms and standards of public relations industry, but raises larger questions as to the relationship of those norms and standards to the public interest. It then confirms the involvement from 1984-86 of Adnan Khashoggi and manager Gurbanafar. And the part that's very important is the links they had with the first channel of funds, where Ted Shackley, Michael Ledeen, were negotiating with Adnan Khashoggi and Gurbanafar for the arms for hostage negotiations to provide the initial channel to the Iranian moderates with whom Reagan administration negotiated power to deliver shipments of US TOW missiles and Hawks missiles to Iran in 1985 and 86. Khashoggi was served as the banker for arms shipments and undercover scheme developed in 85 and 86, and he advanced $1 million in August 1985. Do you like that? And to get the deal going. And according to his own and other published accounts, he provided some $30 million in loans together, depositing money in Swiss bank account controlled by Lake Resources, the company run by former White House aide Oliver North, who played the pivotal role in operation involving arms sales and diversion of funds to the Nicaraguan Contra rebels. The evidence is overwhelming that the links of the funds and the payments with BCCI were going through BCCI Monte Carlo accounts. 2 million to 2.5 million, typically in terms and both Khashoggi and Gurbanafar banked at BCCI offices in Monte Carlo. And this is the key. The BCCI committee was subpoenaing all documentary evidence, particularly the Monte Carlo transactions of BCCI with Khashoggi and Gurbanafar, and Robert Altman refused to provide it. It's all about the Monte Carlo bank accounts. And this links to the secret team financing. As you can see, I've proven beyond doubt the secret team was linked to overseas press services that Danny Sheehan had independently identified had a warehouse of over a ton of C4 explosives, linked to Richard Secord, John Singlaub, Oliver North, and Iran-Contra. And at the same time, Lester Coleman has linked the same company, the same parties are involved in the operations of drugs and arms that were jeopardizing the McKee's team's rescue and their team's rescue of hostages held in Lebanon and also Iran, and linked to the bombing of Pan Am 103. And so the summary here is that during the late summer and early fall involving BCCI officials, BCCI attorneys including Clark Clifford and Robert Altman, it says during those contacts, BCCI advised Subcommittee Counsel that Jack Plum, that in their view, BCCI and his team were obstructing the subcommittee's efforts to investigate the bank. And then later on, in spring 1989, Senator Kerry, chairman of the subcommittee, authorised Blum as he was leaving the subcommittee to provide information he had developed to the Justice Department. After the Justice Department, in Blum's view, had failed to follow up on the information provided, he took the same information to New York District Attorney Robert Montague, who shortly commenced his investigation of BCCI, based in substantial part on the leads provided him by Blum and the subcommittee. And as a result of no action, it cost Denny Casolaro, who was going to Martinsburg to meet with Robert Altman, who was reluctantly meeting with him given he had the smoking gun of the signed BCCI checks through Monte Carlo Bank, signed by Khashoggi and Gorbanifar 1985 for the first negotiation channel, opened with Ted Shackley and Gorbanifar and Khashoggi with Michael Ledeen on the arms for hostage deal. He had the checks that were financed by the Kuwait royal family, by Robert Sensi, who was employed by Robert Gray, William Casey, Clint Murchison, and the Kuwait royal family, the embassy and Kuwait Airlines, who financed those checks that Denny had. The transactions through the Monte Carlo branch of BCCI, check signed by Khashoggi and Gorbanifar, dated 1985, with the letters of credit from the Bank of Monte Carlo and the transfer of the funds and transactions. This evidence was never presented. And so when the author, I interviewed Jack Blum, I found his numbers, his home number in Danny Casolaro's notes. Let's summarise it. I'm the author speaking to Jack Blum. Danny Casolaro was going to Martinsburg to meet with Robert Altman, and he had copies of the BCCI check signed by Adnan Khashoggi and manager Gorbanifar in his briefcase. Were Casolaro's copies of the signed BCCI checks and memos that I have recovered from Casolaro's research files, was it ever forwarded as evidence to the BCCI inquiry, or by the Martinsburg Police, the FBI, or the US Department of Justice investigators? And Jack Blum says, no. I then asked, do you think that Danny Casolaro was in danger having copies of these signed BCCI checks with him in Martinsburg? And Jack Blum responds, if Danny was down in Virginia in CIA territory and waving all those checks around, what did he think would happen? So to summarise, the longest threads weaver pattern. It was Danny Casolaro. His files are sealed, secret, US presidential executive order. I've got B1 classification on his files that I found. Was investigating the theft of Inslaw's PROMIS software. And during his investigations, he discovered the octopus, the secret team. It changed its behaviour when aware it was being observed. It camouflaged itself in a cloak of secrecy and is protected under national security. And over almost 30 years imprisoned Michael Riconosciuto, his files are also sealed secret US presidential executive order B1 classification, B2 and B3. Provided Casolaro access to the longest threads of the international covert operations of this octopus. This empowered Casolaro to weave the pattern of the fabric worn by the octopus, to collapse the probability wave function of its corrupt behaviour and reveal the sixth eye. I believe the long trail of independent evidence has found the key people that I believe are the head of the octopus, that's been behind everything that we've investigated so far, but more importantly, points to their involvement in the significant billion-dollar illegal drug and arms network worth $200 billion for drugs and arms to keep fascist leaders in power, start wars, sell weapons, sell drugs, and control the banks to finance an economy that I think is bigger than the whole of the United States. Are these people? It was George Pender, George Bush Sr., Ted Shackley, William Casey, Robert Gray, and Frank Gallucci, I believe, were the brains. And yes, along the way, Secord and Hakim, and yes, Singlaub, but I think there was a willing party of far-right fanatics. Vigory, the Hunts, Peter Grace, Pat Robertson, and they, in the name of God and public good, knights in white shining armour, the Knights of Malta, are behind willingly providing the infrastructure to be used by the octopus to sell death worldwide. And I think the dirt was controlled by Robert Gray, and all of the directors that he had and brought in was to smear, destroy credible witnesses telling the truth. And that's how you stay in power. That's how you control governments. You control the media and you control justice. Dedicate this podcast to the memory of Danny Casolaro.